Okay, everybody, welcome. It is 6 p.m. for our April 14th Open Space Board of Trustees meeting. As the Vice Chair, I'm going to call the meeting to order today. First, I'd like to start with the roll call. Do we have Karen?
Here.
Do we have Dave?
Here.
Do we have Caroline?
Present.
And do we have Michelle Estrella, our newest board member?
Present.
Thank you. Before we begin, I just wanted to say quickly, this community having lived through a tragedy recently, and this being our first meeting since it, I just thought it might be nice for us to take a moment briefly, quietly, to think about how fortunate we are with this natural landscape around us and the mental health and healing that it does provide people in all shapes and forms. And so I just thought we'd take 3 seconds to consider that. Great. Well, thank you to all the staff members who have joined us this evening, and as well the members of the public who are joining the call. To begin, we're going to start by swearing in our newest trustee, Michelle Estrella. So welcome. I understand, have you been provided with the oath of office?
Yes, I have.
Wonderful. We can go ahead and read that if you would, please.
Oh boy, I'm having technical issues.
No problem.
There we
Michelle,
go.
I have it too if you need me to pull it up.
Excuse me, I got it. Okay. I, Michelle Estrella, do solemnly swear that I will support the Constitution of the United States of America and the state of Colorado and the charter and ordinances of the city of Boulder, and faithfully perform the duties of the office of a member of the Open Space Board of Trustees, which I'm about to enter.
Wonderful. Thank you, Michelle. We're delighted to have you joining us. Welcome. Dan, is there anything else in particular that we need to do, or that seals an official new board member?
I think it does.
Wonderful. Excellent. Well, we'll keep moving right along. The first order of business this evening is that we have a couple elections of officers. We need to elect a new board chair, and we also need to elect a new vice board chair. So I will start. Oh, Karen?
I'd like to nominate Hal Hallstein as new chair.
Wow. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that, Karen. Dave?
I'd like to second that and nominate Karen Holwig as vice chair.
Caroline or Michelle, any thoughts, or should we proceed to a vote?
I second for Karen. And third for you.
Okay, is there a second for the board chair position?
Caroline did that.
Oh, you did? Okay.
I mean, Dave seconded you.
I did the third.
Okay, so I guess we have Caroline on both. Oh, okay, well, Leah, you have the details there. So we will move to a vote. Karen Holwig for the board chair position for myself, Harold Hallstein.
Aye.
Dave Coons.
Yes.
Caroline Miller.
Yes.
Michelle.
Aye.
Thank you. Well, I greatly appreciate it, everyone. Thank you. We'll move right to the vice board chair. Karen Holwig.
Yes.
Yes. And Dave Coons.
Yes.
And Caroline Miller.
Yes.
Wonderful. And Michelle?
Aye.
Wonderful. We have settled business and 2 new officers. With that, before we go to the approval of our last meeting's minutes, I'd like to give the floor to Allison Eklund, who is going to go over our Zoom meeting protocol for the city.
And Hal, we would need to elect our secretary as well right now.
Oh, forgive me. Wonderful. Well, I personally will nominate Leah Case for our board secretary. Is there anyone who willing to second?
Second.
I second.
Great. We'll take the roll one more time, folks. Karen?
Yes.
Wonderful. Dave?
Yes.
Caroline?
Yes.
And Michelle? I think I saw a yes. Wonderful. Well, thank you very much. Your service is always appreciated, Leah. So welcome back. Okay. So with that, Allison.
Okay. Do you all see that first slide? Okay,
Yeah.
great. So thank you for joining us this evening. And in order to strike a balance with transparent engagement and also online security, the following rules will be applied to this meeting tonight. This meeting has been called to conduct the business of the City of Boulder. Activities that disrupt, delay, or otherwise interfere with the meeting are prohibited. The time for speaking or asking questions may be limited, and no person shall speak except when recognized by the person presiding, and no person shall speak for longer than the allotted time. Each person shall register to speak at the meeting using that person's real name, and we will need first and last name. So if you have popped on tonight and you're under Tom's iPad or something like that, you'll have to rename yourself to a first and last name before I can unmute you to speak later on in the meeting. No video will be permitted except for city officials, employees, and invited speakers. All others will participate by voice only. The person presiding at the meeting shall enforce these rules by muting anyone who violates any rule. And the chat function will be enabled to chat with myself only, and those are for Zoom-related questions only, not content. Only the host and individuals designated by the host will be permitted to share their screen during this meeting. That's it.
Thank you, Allison. With that, we are going to move to the approval of minutes from our prior meeting. The draft is on page 3 of our packets, folks. Does anybody have any updates for page 1? Karen?
I have a couple of revisions to the motion based on my notes. Under number 2, on the 7th line, after the word accomplished, it should say by OSMP with existing resources.
Okay, wonderful.
And then on number 3, I know we did a lot of revisions just based on the scribbles on my page. And I think the first part that is there is correct. But I also had another clause after that, which says at no cost for OSMP purposes, because that water is essential to provide meaningful restoration, particularly of the mined area, and to provide supplemental irrigation of areas affected by variant 1 groundwater disruption. And I think because of the importance of the reasoning there, I think it's important to be sure that that's in the minute notes.
Does anyone have any issues with that? Seeing none, or
Oh, sorry, Dave, go ahead and then I'll ask my question.
I was going to move on to 5. So Leah, if you want to speak to the other one, go ahead.
I only wanted to ask was, I'm not sure, to be honest, what this rule is about adding to the motion once, if it's not something that was actually said and I misrepresented it, if we're adding to it after the fact, I'm not sure if we can.
It's in the original written motion that you had on the screen. So it's not new words that I'm creating. It's something that was in the motion that was on the screen at the time of the board's decision. It just, because we revised the first part of number 3 so much, for some reason or other, the last part got left off.
Okay, I'll leave it to the board then. Or Dan, if you. Just trying to think about what was sent, like what council has already seen versus, well, I'll leave it to, if the board is okay with it, then we'll figure out how to make sure the revised version gets to where it needs to be.
I guess I'd ask, does anyone else have that recollection that that was what was on the screen?
I don't have the exact recollection, Hal, but I have a recollection that language to that effect was being considered.
This is the document that I submitted to Leah in Word that was on the screen. And what I've highlighted in green is the part that I want to add back.
Well, this is a remarkable challenge for my first evening. I wish there was some guidance or something on this. I guess I certainly, we don't want to be in this habit, but if that is the document that you submitted to the secretary, that is what should be represented in this draft minutes, I believe.
The other thing, Hal, we could just make an amendment to the motion and vote on that as the board. It strikes me that that would suffice as well.
You know, that adds a level of officialness to such an amendment. I think that is probably smart. So Karen, we will accept this update as your motion to amend the existing motion, and I will seek a second on the board for that.
Second.
You have a second from Caroline. So I'll call the roll. Karen
Yes?
and Dave, do you approve?
Yes.
Caroline
Yes.
and Michelle, how do you feel about that?
I think I should abstain.
Oh, that's correct. Forgive me. Yep. Okay, so we have 4, and I also approve. So we have 4 votes to amend the motion and adopt the language as described by Karen originally presented. So, Dave?
If we're ready, I'd like to move on to number 5 on the motion.
Yeah, let's keep moving. Wonderful. Do you have everything you need, Leah? Great.
Dan, before I do that, I have a question for you. Is the status of the motion, has this been officially conveyed to council? Do you know, or?
I might have to turn to John Potter if he's on yet for the details of where it actually is. I know it's been incorporated into the briefing book.
Right.
And it might have gone in as a preliminary, in a preliminary memo. That's going to be in council's hand at the end of April. But John, do you have any details on how far it's gone at this point?
Yeah, it's in the briefing book, Dan, and that is referenced in the draft memo to council, a link to that briefing book.
So thanks for that. I would like to suggest that the motion get conveyed to council directly, independent of the briefing book, just to make sure that they have the complete motion language to consider. And one of the so let me keep going. One of the reasons for that I looked at the briefing book and compared the language in the briefing book to the language in the motion. And it just struck me in number 5, there's the sentence that we approved as part of the motion. The city should develop specific requirements to ensure the university will prevent light and noise impacts on the adjacent lands, particularly, for example, from nighttime sports, etc. That language was in the briefing book, but there is no agreement at all by CU that they accept that. In fact, what they accepted was the restrictions that are in the city code. And I want to emphasize that we as the board in this motion language said that we were not satisfied with the city code regarding lighting and noise, and that we wanted more specific requirements for the CU's use of that property. So I'd like to emphasize that as an example.
Okay, so I can communicate to planning staff that we would like the full motion attached to any memo going to council. Is that what I'm understanding, Dave?
That'd be great. Thank you very
Okay.
much.
Yep.
Good, thanks.
Thank you, John.
May I just add one sentence? I was in communication with Phil Kleisler today to see if I could get any specificity on exactly what is allowed by current Boulder revised code in terms of lighting and sound. And he said because of a number of things, he hasn't been able to get to that, but within another week or so, he should be able to get that to us. So that's still forthcoming.
Great.
Yes, that's right, Karen. And we'll also, our OSMP staff will also look at that as well. So
Great, thanks.
Okay. Any other issues on page 2 of the draft minutes? Karen,
I move that we approve the minutes of March 10th as amended.
I second.
great. Let's call the roll. Karen,
Yes?
Dave,
Yes.
Caroline,
Yes.
Michelle.
Jane?
Great. All right. Excellent.
Le-
Proceeding.
Leah, if I could make a request, could you get this final version of these approved minutes to John so he could make sure they get into planning staff's hands? Thank you.
Wonderful. Allison, with that done, I'd like to turn it back over to you, and perhaps you can tell us or you ask people if they'd like to raise their hand. We'll get an idea. And I believe we normally choose between 2 or 3 minutes. I'm only seeing one hand at this time, so we're biasing towards 3, I believe.
Okay, and we did have one person sign up online ahead of time. So first up, we have Alan Delemere. And let me find him. I know he was on. Oh, yeah. Alan, you should be able to unmute yourself now. And please just say your first and last name, and then Leah will start the time.
Okay, you're going to show my picture?
No, unfortunately, we're not allowed to turn on cameras.
Okay. Right. Basically,
Alan, I will say we all have your presentation here. The board members all have it, and we can look at it as you speak.
that's exactly the way I'd like it to go. So let me start off by, this is unfinished business. And with the pandemic over the last year, I have not been very active with the Open Space Board of Trustees. Most of you know many presentations I've made. So basically, slide 1 is the outstanding issues, and there are 3 unresolved questions. 1 is trail surface maintenance. 2nd, early detection of fires, and parking for sanitors. So slide 3 is the surface maintenance. And what we have here is the $40 million backlog caused us all to take very deep breaths a couple of years ago. And I committed to walk all the red trails and really do my own assessment with my friends. Now, unfortunately, my map was out of date, and I ended up being shown the current map last year on a computer screen at the hub. And I immediately spotted some errors. And I asked for a copy of the new map so I could continue my walks. But that's still not yet available. Unless, Dan, you've got it in some secret place, you could let me have it, but I'd appreciate it. So I think the actions that I see on this, I'd really like to see the map released And I would like to see regular monthly updates on trail maintenance progress, the dollars spent out of the 40 million that we know about, and what the trail lengths that have been converted from red to green. So that's that. Now, I'll give you one example. The next slide 4, I show a nice picture of pasque flowers. And it's one of my favorite trails, is the Sunshine Canyon Trail for flowers. And the new map shows it as green. And there's no way, in my opinion, that it's green. It's green, it's red. It's got sticky mud, particularly in the first quarter of mile. It's too narrow in the steep sections. You have to turn sideways to pass people. There are a few exposed roots on it, and it's also designated for horse travel. Fortunately, horse people are sensible enough. I've never seen any evidence of a horse on it. So I suggest that you trustees form your own opinion and hike the trail and enjoy the flowers and observe the baked-in footprints and recommend some action for Dan and crew to take to really get our trails properly maintained. Okay, the next thing is fire detection. It looks like my time's almost up, unless you're willing to give me a minute or two more. I submitted a fire protection plan and have had no proper response, and I think we need it, and we need early detection of the fires. And then the last item is parking for Sanitas. And if you go to the last slide, you'll see the cars parked up Sunshine Canyon. We have not addressed the parking for Sanitas, despite promises by open space staff. It will be addressed in the open space plan. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Alan, and we appreciate you putting your comments in written form.
Hal,
Yes, Karen?
may I ask one quick follow-up question?
By all means.
Alan, you refer to the Sunshine Canyon Trail. Is that the one that goes directly adjacent to the, or parallel to the road?
Yes, that's it.
Okay.
Yeah, go up and enjoy the past flowers. It's beautiful at the moment.
I just wanted to make sure I understood which one you were referring to. Thanks.
Okay, next up we have Lynn Siegel, but I wanted to mention if you have joined us this evening and you would like to speak during public comment, you can raise your hand now and get in line. If you open your participants icon at the bottom of the screen, and at the bottom of that box, you should have the option to raise your hand. And sometimes it's in the reactions icon at the bottom too. You can raise your hand from that icon as well. So you can do that now if you want to speak. But up next we have Lynn Siegel. And Lynn, you should be able to unmute now.
If you could see my video, you'd see my thumb running against my fingers, which is the uniform symbol of it's all about the money. So that's what I have for you tonight. I have to get off the screen. It's no coincidence that, you know, what your work here is to save money for the open space board, you know, the open space department. It's no coincidence that the Blue Line ballot measure of 1959 elicited a challenge by an owner placed outside of the Blue Line. In 1962, this resulted in an attempt by the owner at annexation and transformation of, not Sioux South this time, of Enchanted Mesa. We're talking 1962. The area between Skunk Creek and Chautauqua, Enchanted Mesa, into a Boulder Broadmoor, a big hotel with 60 to 100 or up to 160 homes, if coupled with Bluebell water rights. The owner, Ken Myrise of Colorado Springs, bought it for $113,000 $13,000, my glasses, in 1952, 2 years earlier, the year before I was born. In response, the city narrowly passed a bond issue to fund its purchase for $105,000. A condemnation trial ensued. Myra wanted 1.24 million, but was offering 250,000. And allegedly he could reasonably sell it for 876,000. These are pretty different figures as you're gathering. A free market real estate appraisal of 215,000 to rise to 250,000 if annexed increased the value by 1/3. In other words, annexation increases the value that much. City appraisals ranged from 67 to 75,000. The resulting adjudication, this is in condemnation court, of 115,000 compelled the city to come up with the additional 20,000, including 10,000 court costs. Parks and Recreation fronted the money, but the citizens were assisted by Walter Orr Roberts of NCAR, grateful for crossing the blue line by way of a conservation easement to put NCAR up there. The Boulder International Folk Dancers conducted 3 50-cent per entry benefits, including at 8 to 9 p.m. dance instruction and dancing from 9 to 11, and the city was able to pay back Parks and Rec. Now, if you don't want to be stuck with the bill that this friggin' CU South is going to cost the city, and it's going to decimate the city. This is going to destroy the city. You know, when my dad came here in 1957, you know, it was 30,000 people.
Lynn, thank you very much for the historical perspective. We did offer 3 minutes there. It's appreciated.
Thanks.
And do we have anyone else, Allison?
No, I'm not seeing any other hands. We do have one person signed up for the public hearing when we get to that.
Okay, great. With that, we will move to our first primary agenda item tonight. It's a request for a recommendation to City Council to amend Boulder Revised Code 572, possession and consumption of alcoholic beverages on public property prohibited. Dan, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. I believe I'll have a couple of staff members helping out with this item tonight. Lisa Gonzalo, our recreation coordinator, and Burton Stoner, our ranger supervisor, will be introducing this subject to you. So Burton or Lisa, I don't know which one of you are going first.
Thanks, Dan. I'll start us off.
Great.
But Lisa is definitely on ready to answer any questions as they come up, but I'll handle the bulk of the presentation here. Leah, can you pull that up for me, please? As you can tell, I'm actually in my vehicle in another spot.
I don't know if we've ever had this before. This is
We've
great,
not.
Burton.
giving it a go. We'll see how it plays out. But I did want to recognize Lisa for all of her collaborative work on working with Parks and Recreation, Boulder Police Department, and the city attorneys to come up with this recommendation. And so kudos to her for a lot of all the legwork here as we work through this staff recommendation. So again, this will be attachment B in the packet that was given out. So next slide, please. So just a quick background. So up to 2019, the state statute was allowed for 3.2% content alcohol. And if you remember, before all the craft beers came out, that was only a select few beers that were actually allowed on open space mountain parks property in cans. So again, bottled glass is not allowed as well. So just some couple of fine points there. The other thing that was in place was the code 575A that allowed for the consumption of beer and wine with a facility use permit at our designated facilities and shelters. So think about the Summit, Flagstaff Summit shelters, the Halfway House, those kinds of places. That's what we're talking about. Next slide, please. So in 2019, the state passed the Senate Bill 197, and it did eliminate that category of alcohol, 3.2%. And so it now prohibits the consumption of alcohol greater than 0.5% near beer in any public space unless local authorities adopt other ordinances. And that's what we're about tonight, is this other ordinance category. Next slide. So what we'll be looking at is an update to 572, which is the current possession and consumption of alcoholic beverages in public prohibited within the city limits. And so those are the words that we're looking to amend tonight. So next slide. So our recommendation will be to amend that ordinance 572 to bring the state statute and the city Boulder Revised Code into alignment that will prohibit consumption of alcohol on open space and mountain parks managed property. Next slide. This will then allow for the rangers to use discretion as they do to enforce any ordinance. So as in enforcement of this code, to really manage the amount of littering, trash, and kinds of issues that we do not want to see primarily up in the Flagstaff Road corridor is really the area that we'll be looking at, where we see the bulk of our violations of this and the issues of trash and littering that accompany this. We will then be able to bring into alignment our signs and messaging, and then we will continue to allow the consumption of beer and wine with a facility use permit at those designated OSMP shelters and facilities. And again, our goal is to support a safe and welcoming environment for all visitors. Next. Yeah, pretty quick. Wanted to turn it back for any questions to the board.
Well, thank you, Burton. We see you out, it looks like almost actively patrolling, so we take it especially seriously. So yes, does anyone have any clarifying questions for Burton? Dave?
Burton, thanks for that, and I appreciate that. And I'm glad that we're actually doing this. The question I have, though, is that in my reading of the ordinance, it strikes me that the language on the facilities is an artifact of a different time and situation. And that is that most of the facilities, as you noted, are on Flagstaff or on mountain parks properties. And at the time that I think that ordinance language was written, those facilities were accessible by vehicle. The concern I have is for this ordinance to continue to identify facilities that I consider to be interior to the system. And two examples are Green Mountain Lodge and Bluebell Shelter. And I don't think it is appropriate for us as the Open Space Department to permit the consumption of alcohol on facilities that, require people to, walk a fair distance in order to get there. So my recommendation would be to revise that list of facilities that we would permit for alcohol consumption. I think it's a historic artifact of a different time, and the situation is not the same currently.
Does anybody else have questions?
Thanks, Dave.
Or Burton, you want to
Go ahead,
respond? Yeah. Burton, would you like to respond to that?
Sure, that's a good consideration. I would just say that with that permit, rangers would be aware of that event happening. And so we could be proactive about checking into those situations if we decided to leave those facilities in the, sorry, my phone's going crazy, apologize.
Burton, I just think it sets an unfortunate precedent and gives the wrong impression for other visitors as to what appropriate activities are, on open space property. So I guess we can discuss that further as we go along, but thanks.
You bet, Dave. Thanks for bringing it up. It's a good point.
Caroline?
Hey, thank you for your presentation, Burton. Can you talk to me a little bit about the difference between the use permit and the special event permit?
So
Similarities
we,
and differences.
oh, Lisa, if you have something on that, let me know. So the facility reservation system, is that what you're referring to? So that people can reserve one of our facilities for a certain designated amount of time for a certain rate. And then what we're talking about is there would be an additional alcohol permit that would be allowed under the 575A work that Lisa is working on.
And what you just spoke on, is that the special event permit or?
No, there's a facility use, so not a commercial use permit, but there is a facility use permit system.
Okay, I think I just wanted, as we move along with the discussion and whoever, if there's someone else that's better to answer the question, just so I really understand the difference between the two permits, differences and similarities.
Yeah, I can try and help. It's a great question. So historically 575A, they have used open space and mountain parks, and Parks and Recreation have used very different policies and procedures in order to allow for various percentages of alcohol for a special event. So historically and moving forward, what our goal is for open space facilities and rentals would be that we would typically not allow a special event permit. So that opens the door for spirits, liquor consumption. It tends to be around competitive events, which are not allowed on open space and mountain parks. So open space has historically and will continue to use the facility use reservation policy. So essentially, you would go online, you would reserve a facility, and one of the 6 or 7 that we've identified, which Dave, I appreciate your comments on Green Mountain and Blue, but that's something we can definitely consider excluding as we move forward with that policy. You would go on, you'd reserve it. Typically, it's been weddings, the amphitheater, large family gatherings, that kind of thing, above live staff. With that permit, then you are allowed to request a alcohol permit that for open space is restricted to just beer and wine. So you could then consume beer and wine with that facility use permit and then the alcohol permit on top of it. So it just opens up that door for kind of what open space considers a special event.
Karen.
Just for clarity, Lisa, my understanding is the facility permit is through OSMP, correct?
Correct.
And is the alcohol permit also through OSMP?
It's a citywide alcohol permit.
Okay, and then the special use permit, that's through the state, right?
So city, and then there's a Colorado special event, which is state. So I think
there's three different levels of government involved here, right?
Yeah, potentially, yeah.
And what I think I heard you say was that the special event permits were not allowed on OSMP, correct?
It's not something that we've done, yeah.
Yeah, and I don't think that's clear in the documents that we got, because I read through very clearly and I marked the part under the city manager rule that speaks to special event permit, and it sounds like it's for parks, but it doesn't explicitly say not for OSMP lands. And I think that would be really good to clarify and get solid in the documents that we're dealing with, so that it's obvious that a special event permit on OSMP lands is not allowed, as you said earlier.
Great, I appreciate that.
Caroline, back to you.
Thank you. And again, whoever is up for answering this question. So on page 9, number 7, I just, and maybe someone can clarify it for me, but as I read this, it troubles me a bit with, in regards to responsibility. All participants associated with a city alcohol permit must be at least 21 years of age or accompanied by a parent or guardian. So that basically says you can be under 21. And then unless a Colorado special events permit is issued, which we just said we don't do. So I think that the age that someone could get an alcohol permit and not be 21 kind of jumped out at me, if that is perhaps what's happening in number 7. So I didn't know if anyone could maybe clarify that a little bit for me.
Yeah, thank you for that. So the Boulder Licensing Authority actually weighed in on, because we're trying to align 575 with the citywide effort, which the bulk of this document, probably 75% of it really pertains to parks and recreation managed lands and not so much open space. And so this is something that, because open space doesn't allow Colorado special events permits, and we historically haven't, we will probably continue to do that, it really wouldn't pertain to open space. And I think part of the challenge for staff and why you see the number of edits was to try to differentiate parks and recreation from open space a little bit more clearly. We're happy to do that a little bit further if the board recommends that, because we do manage alcohol permits differently.
Does anybody else have, Karen, I see you again, yeah.
And then can you clarify, Lisa, directly under that for number 8? It says permits will be issued for city alcohol use during park and facility hours of operation. I just want to clarify what that means for OSMP.
Yep, exactly.
Again, it's the same issue.
Yep, and so again, this is a Parks and Recreation number, and so we can differentiate this a little bit more. And I appreciate the need for clarity, because really, Parks and Recreation saw this as they were calling out specific athletic fields and facility hours that were no longer applicable, or that they just wanted to broaden the perspective. And so this wouldn't be pertain to open space. So I'll come back to this group and recommend some differentiation between the two departments.
Yeah, and I think if we do allow alcohol permits on OSMP, is that correct?
Yes.
And is it true that they are allowed during daylight hours
Correct.
for OSMP?
Yes.
Okay. Clarifying that, I think, would be a great move. And then I had one other quick question. It's on agenda item 4, page 5. The language as amended for C1 makes it really clear that it's public highway, street, alley, walk, parking lot, building, city park, parkway, recreation area, open space. And the one that I was missing is greenway. And I don't know whether greenway needs to be added, but I only ask it because it's so specific with so many things listed.
It's a good question. I can ask the city attorney.
Dave.
So Lisa, I think following up on what Karen said, I think it would be helpful in clarifying, looking at the title of the ordinance, it's, city parks and recreation and open space lands. So in my mind, every time the ordinance language references parks and recreation, there ought to be a similar reference to open space so that it's clear, especially in those places where there is a differentiation of management, what that is. And if there is no differentiation, then it would be parks and recreation and open space and mountain parks. But I think from my perspective, it would be very helpful to have every time parks is referenced, the open space has to be referenced as well, because it's an ordinance that covers both. So I would just suggest that you take a look and try and make that happen.
Great, appreciate that, Dave.
Hi, Carolyn.
Karen's question kind of got me thinking. So alcohol permits are issued and consumption is allowed during the daytime. Is it allowed at nighttime? Like, do our permits allow people to continue drinking past dark? And if so, is there a time cutoff limit, or how does that work?
Yeah, so great question. Our facility use reservation permits don't go past, I believe, 9 o'clock, 9 p.m. And so
That's correct.
because you have to have a facility use reservation to get an alcohol permit, then all alcohol permits that would be issued would expire with the facility use permit.
I'd like to interject my own thought here. I wasn't anticipating quite as much granularity here. For my own part, the fact that there is permitting and oversight by the department on much of this use seemed somewhat ample to me. Would someone from staff describe what your time frame is on this? What other dependencies might exist on getting it to council, et cetera?
Is that reference the 575A?
Yes.
Wonderful. So thank you for asking. Actually, so 572 is a Boulder revised code that we're looking to amend, and we're seeking specific recommendations from the board to approve this as it goes to council. 575A is a city manager rule. So the process would be a little bit different, a little bit less robust. And so the board's comments for 575A could be incorporated a lot easier. So that would be a continuing conversation if that's the board's preference for 575A.
So essentially a bit of a dual track on these.
Yes.
Okay. Caroline.
Hey, thank you. So just because I don't know, and I'm sure it obviously varies between summer and winter and other, cycles for when people are asking for these permits. But the nighttime, I just feel like in our packet, as we talk about, moving forward in 2021 and working with the National Park Service night skies and natural sound divisions to learn more about noise impact. We all kind of know if you go to a party during the day and it turns into night, things just typically get a little louder. And I am a bit concerned about us allowing alcohol consumption past dark. I know that kind of in the summer, that pretty much aligns with dark, but depending on the time of year and when it's giving out, it's hours after. And my concern is just for our wildlife and natural habitat that we're not doing things that are negatively impacting that without really a lot of benefit to OSMP for it. So I just want to kind of make that statement or comment.
A question about that comment, Carolyn. You're not suggesting that we pick apart the use permit, because the use permit currently allows to 9 p.m. But you're suggesting overlaying the alcohol times to be more restrictive than the use permit.
Yeah.
Because I think the people being there, the people are going to be there, whether they're having a glass of wine or not, the people are going to be there.
Yeah, thank you. That was actually a really great way to clarify that. I think that is what I'm saying is that people being there, might not be as much of the issue as if people, started at 4 and they're ending at 5, and alcohol is continued to be served into the nighttime. So that's probably a lot better said the way that Michelle put it. So thank you for adding to that.
I think part of this whole effort is to provide some easeability and some flexibility for the rangers to do enforcement. And I think that if we've got a dual system of an allowable use till 9, and with that it's paired with alcohol, but that ends at, let's say, 8 or 8:30, we're in a situation where is there going to be an expectation that the rangers are expected to enter that event and see if anybody's drinking who's allowed to be there, but the alcohol time expired? To me, that's a really unreasonable expectation. And so it probably would just be existing in the books without any sort of expectation that our rangers will be mingling into an event to check to see if somebody has a drink in their hand after the expiration of the alcohol time. I don't know, Burton, if you, I know the whole sort of spirit behind this was the enforceability and to help rangers out with consistency. And it seems like if we had mixed pairings, we're getting away from that consistency.
I'll jump in to mention for myself, I personally wouldn't support differentiation. I'm perfectly comfortable with a 9 p.m. cutoff for alcohol. You see a thumbs up from Michelle on that.
Maybe just a question that I don't know the answer to. For the permits, is there a limit to the amount of persons?
Oh,
Actually, yeah, there is. And I believe that came to the board in a written update just recently. But Leah might be able to speak to that more in terms of capacities for our shelter reservations.
Sure. In non-COVID times, it just changed for the summit facilities on Flagstaff to be 100 people. So right now it's obviously different, but.
Lee, if the board wanted to reference, was that January written memo or it was this winter? There was a recent memo in which we actually reduced the number.
Maybe in February, but I can very recently.
Yeah.
And that's for during COVID times, or that's permanently?
That would be permanent. So obviously the numbers are less now. It's changing all the time, but the normal, yeah, it dropped from 150 to 100.
For an OSMP use permit for one of the shelters?
On Flagstaff. So
on Flagstaff, okay.
It doesn't include Green Mountain Lodge, Bluebell Shelter, or Halfway House.
Thank you.
The way I view this is that, I mean, the worst offenders out there are those who are not getting use permits, where, they are, and I'm a climber, I take my kids out bouldering at Flagstaff, and there's broken glass everywhere. And I see this as a serious danger to our community, and we need to equip our rangers with the tools to regulate this. And making it more complicated is not going to make it easier for them to regulate it. The worst offenders are going to be out there, the ones who are out there partying, not the people who are out there with a valid use permit going until 9 p.m. So I really like to support moving this along.
Thank you, Michelle. In that, Burton?
just one quick to follow up on that. Thank you, Michelle, for the comments. And in all honesty, because it's currently only a state statute, rangers cannot actually write that ticket currently for the prohibition of alcohol. So that's our main intent by amending the 572 order, is to give rangers that tool. Just wanted to call that out if that wasn't clear in the memo.
And where is the prohibition on glass?
That is another current code that the city has that we can enforce, and that's typically what we use.
Great. In the interest of moving this agenda item forward, Dan, I'm going to try on an idea. I'm curious your comments. In this sense that there is a somewhat of a dual track here, can we begin by looking at the first document ending where they're preparing for the mayor's signature on section 572? Does anyone have anything that's giving them very material or specific heartburn on that document? I, for one, have none. Or are people's problems more focused in on the city manager rule? Karen, to your thought about greenways, I really appreciate the idea, but I just, I don't believe, can we do that stuff on the fly here, Dan? Explain to me what the parameters are.
And how, let me just speak to that, because I was going to circle back to that, is I think because in the code it talks about other public places that, given the greenways are public places, anything that is owned as a public space by the city, it's adequately covered that it's trying to capture any of those. So I really don't think we need to be that specific and worry, because it is well covered and it has been covered under the code.
I just saw a nod by Karen, so I feel like we can move past that.
Fine.
Great. So does anybody, okay, go ahead.
I have a quick question on G. I have read that 4 times and I have no idea what G says.
Sorry, Karen, I'm just rereading
Yeah, it
this.
is a little technical.
Does that,
Yep.
does that mean you can sit in a car for hire and drink your heart out?
I'll have to relook at this because this is something that we're not looking to change. This is something that's already existing in the ordinance. So the intent behind it, I haven't been involved in that. I'm not sure.
I don't know that anybody has read it and really thought about it because, or else I'm really missing something.
If I'm reading this correctly, Karen, this is about, you've got to, the defense is, or I'm sorry, you've got to be, the alcohol actually has to be in your trunk and not immediately accessible to you in the vehicle. That was what I think this is getting to, is people try and raise the defense that the container was closed. So sorry, Al.
Okay, but what is the other than one carrying passengers for hire mean?
I think it would be easy for us to delve deep into it. My main reading here is that there is a defense available if you're crossing a brief moment of greenway to a place where you are allowed to be engaged in such activity. And that's understandable to me. Does that feel right to you, Burton?
It does.
But this doesn't have anything to do with greenways. This has to do with sitting in the driver's seat.
I'm looking at the other part of it, but yeah, okay. I mean, is that of express concern to us?
I mean, I think maybe not, but it is worth pointing out that if what was just said is that no one's really looked at that maybe someone now could.
I'm Michelle, I see you. I'm comfortable personally for us to just communicate here through this meeting that it's a little bit opaque and hard to understand. But I do not feel that there's anything going on there that is askant to open space values.
I don't expect us to resolve it. I just would appreciate it if staff would ask what that means.
Agreed.
Great.
Okay.
So it seems then with us, we're moving forward and we feel good about the recommendations on the first document. And Lisa, if I heard you right, you think you're more open to a little bit of discussion on the second document and that we can maybe be a little more granular there. Is that the correct understanding? Because this is a slightly different track.
Correct. Yeah, I think if you're okay with it, the process, I believe, moving forward would be board ask questions, particularly about 572, which is what we're seeking immediate recommendations for.
Yep.
We'd open it up to public comment, let the public, if there's anyone that would be wanting to share their thoughts on this, go to recommendation. And then if you're feeling the need, be happy to discuss more about 575 if that works.
Okay, great. Does anyone else have anything there? And forgive me, I find this a little bit confusing myself. I'm going to refer back to our agenda. So we're going to take this piece open to the public comment next and then return. Great.
So Hal, this piece means 572?
This is my understanding. Yep, the part we just discussed. So I guess with that, I would like to ask Allison where we stand on interested parties in comment.
Yep, we have one person who signed up ahead of time online to speak, and that's Lisa Spalding. So Lisa, you can unmute yourself now and just say your first and last name, and then Lisa will start the time. Anyone else wishing to speak now can also raise their hands to get in line.
Lisa Spalding. I do have one question. Most of my comments are about 575A. So if you would allow me to talk about that now, it would be, or if you want me to wait.
I'm comfortable with hearing from you on that now.
Okay. I'm really happy to hear the conversation you're having because you're all asking the right questions. I served for 10 years on the Beverage Licensing Authority, and I saw how badly things could spin out of control when alcohol was served to large crowds at events in Boulder's parks. And there are some very vaguely defined aspects of this. It's 575A is the basic problem. And there are a few questions that you've all had. I know Karen's question about the prohibition, well, about the permission for people to be drinking in, it's limousine drinking basically. And you have to remember that this whole 5752 or 572 it's all about prohibitions throughout the entire city. It's like kids drinking on the hill with open containers walking around. It's everything. So you're kind of pulling out of that what applies to open space and parks. So the permitted hours, you really need to have those defined before you make a recommendation to City Council, specifically for the reasons that you guys were talking about. Parks and Rec is way on a different page. And Parks and Rec is having some pretty serious issues with their proposal for the reservoir. They want to turn it into, operate it as an event center, restaurant, and bar that could operate any day of the year until midnight. And you're going to see a groundswell of opposition, not just from the neighborhood, but from the general public to this. So just stay away from that completely. The maximum number of people for each facility should be defined before you make a recommendation. And then it's wonderful to hear you don't have special event permits because that is a huge no-no. And Caroline, you were asking about that. Special event permits there's a state liquor permit that's for special events. And basically the difference is that those are events where you can sell or dispense alcohol to the public. So you want to keep these as private events, and that sounds like that's what you're doing. And whatever you do, keep it at beer and wine. That's like really essential. I can go on about the horrible situations we saw before the liquor board with things that Parks and Recs, these big athletic events and all, but it sounds like you have that under control. So anyway, those are my main concerns. And it does sound like things are under control with what you're doing, but I would really differentiate between open space and mountain parks and Parks and Rec, because you're just in completely different territory on this. Thanks.
Thank you, Lisa.
I see one more. I see one more hand, Lynn Siegel. Lynn, you can unmute yourself now.
Amen to Lisa, but then I'm a prohibitionist, modern day prohibitionist. I don't think there should be any alcohol. I mean, I like to have Midori and some kind of juice once every 10 years, but I could give it up if there was no alcohol available. There shouldn't be any ever at any time for anybody under any conditions. Life's too short. We've got too much strife going on in the world to be playing around. And certainly not in cars. I have the same feeling about the reservoir and the events. I mean, obviously we're not going to be having events, but the opportunity to have events is, I mean, the virus has taught us that events are like not all they're cracked up to be anyway. Interestingly, Dick Tharp was the guy who cut the CU purchase deal with Flatiron's property with the gravel company, and he was collaborating with the former city council member that ran Liquor Mart, and he was basically fired from CU in 2004 for all of his athletic people doing sex things. And I mean, all of the money that's spent on all of this is such a waste when we have like Ellen Delemere coming here and saying, where's the cleaning up? Where's the, where's the trail money? That's where it all is. It's gone down the toilet on these kind of things. There's just not room for that. So I completely agree with everything Lisa said. And except that no beer, no wine, no anything, nothing, zero, water. Water works fine. We're lucky we have that still. And by the way, I think it takes 4 parts water to make 1 glass of beer, so nope, there's people starving in Yemen. No time for this kind of hedonism. Sorry, I'm very old school, but that's my feeling on the subject. And especially for considering the expense. I mean, the expense of proving if somebody raped somebody when they were both so drunk they didn't know what was happening. I mean, it's just such a wastage of people's lives. It's like revolting. Done.
Thank you very much, Lynn. Appreciate it. Okay, so reading again in detail, what we have set in front of us is a recommendation on BRC 572. And we could move forward with such a recommendation now and close that piece of business, then return to a more specific discussion on 575A. I guess that would be my preference, but I'm open to people seeing any problems with that approach. I don't see any problems. Karen.
I'd be glad to make a motion that OSBT recommends that staff proceed with the revisions for BRC 572.
I'll second that.
Great. I just, they offered us specific language. I thought should we use that as the motion? Excellent, thank you.
Sure, that's fine.
Wonderful, and we have a second on the motion. And who was that? Sorry, I missed it.
Michelle.
Michelle, wonderful. So we'll call the roll. Karen.
Yes.
Dave.
Yes.
Caroline.
Yes.
Michelle. And I vote affirmatively. So we'll proceed with that recommendation. And now let's go back to 575A, and we'll focus our attention there for more guidance to staff. So we sort of crossed from a few clarifying questions into specific requests. Let's go back now that we have that on the floor and ask for the specific areas of concern that you'd like us to consider again. Dave.
So I had 2. So Lisa, I am suggesting that we revise the list of appropriate facilities that would be suitable for such permits and remove Green Mountain Lodge and Bluebell Shelter from that list, and possibly others, depending on the caveat that they should not be interior to the open space system. The other suggestion I had was that every time the ordinance language references parks and recreation for whatever specific item, that open space and mountain parks be referenced as well, so that the clarity is in the ordinance language on whatever's different in the management between those 2 city departments.
Yeah, Karen, is your comment on Dave's point or a
It
different?
is.
Okay,
It
good.
is. Just a quick question. Is Bluebell Shelter the one that's on Chautauqua by the auditorium?
Well, it's up above, yeah, it's up above Chautauqua. It's up above the meadow. It's on the old road that goes past the.
Okay, but it's not the Bluebell, I thought it was called Bluebell Picnic Area next to the Chautauqua Auditorium?
It is not that.
Okay,
No.
all right, thank you.
I'd like to go to Caroline and Michelle for your thoughts on Dave's proposal.
I agree with what Dave said, and then let Michelle and I have something to add whenever we get there.
Great. Michelle, what are your thoughts on that proposal?
I don't have any opposition to making those adjustments.
Okay. It seems then that there's unified interest, Lisa, in a clarification on those locations.
Great, thank you.
What is the next point of specific business people would like to discuss? Caroline.
I thought that it was a good idea what Lisa Spalding suggested, that for each of the shelters that we know and that is written for how many people can be at each particular one. And then it probably wouldn't really fit in with language, or maybe it would. I would think it would be good for open space if the person that asked for the permit was willing to say that they had some sort of alignment with something like the Leave No Trace campaign, and that they were willing to go above and beyond what is necessary to make sure that they leave the facility the way that they found it.
Okay, let's take the first part of that first. Lisa, do these locations already have those capacity constraints established and we know what they are? So it's just a matter of adding those numbers here. And do you see any big problem with that?
No.
I bring up an administrative problem. So right now this winter, we went and made some changes and some adjustments to what we thought were capacity adjustments. So just administratively, over time, we could get out of whack. Let's just say we wanted Bluebell, we ought to knock that down by 2. Then we're going to have to go through a city manager rule change and bring Parks and Rec in and go through all of this again to change a number. So it's anytime you get really specific in a rule, then it provides less flexibility to look at each individual shelter and make some adjustments over time on through the permitting process. But that would be one concern I would have by making it too specific in the rule.
And then for clarity, I think the issue is that those numbers, those limits are part of the OSMP facility permit system, right? I think that's the lack of clarity is people not understanding that the permits already have the limit in them.
They're not going to the city manager's rule to find out what they can do. They're going to find out what they can do and what the constraints are within the specific permit that we give them.
And sorry, I just want to make sure that I'm following. Is that what had to happen when we reduced? I know for COVID, there was probably like an emergency umbrella that allowed it. But when we reduced it from whatever you said it was to the 150, is that what had to happen? The city manager had to approve that?
No, and
I'm missing something.
right now we have the flexibility to quickly make adjustments on capacities for individual shelters. But if we then embed it within a city manager's rule that brings in other departments, then anytime we want to make a specific change to a shelter and we repeat that language in the city manager's rule, then the city manager's rule gets outdated.
Got it. So as of now, for any of our shelters, for any permit, the amount of people allowed to attend would be 100 or 150?
I heard that it's specific to the permit issuance and specific to the place. What
Right, and then,
I
and
heard,
then there's a specific number overall for the top, for all of the top of flag staff, bringing that down from 150 to 100.
personally, what I'm hearing here is that if I were to apply for a permit, I'd receive a specific document guiding on the capacity constraint, that Burton Stoner is going to know very well what that capacity constraint is, and that it being in this rule wouldn't reach the end user anyway and would just create an administrative problem. And I find that personally convincing. Does that work for you, Caroline?
Dave, were you going to say something about that?
Dave?
Yeah, I was just going to say that I agree with Dan, but I do think that it might be worth clarifying in the ordinance language, and Lisa just referencing the open space, mountain parks department, facility permitting process or something, so that in the ordinance language, there is some acknowledgement that these constraints or requirements are in a formal or official permitting process.
It's a city manager rule, correct? Not an ordinance.
Yeah, right now we're talking about the rule.
Right. Oh, sorry. Right.
That recommendation feels really good to me, just to clarify in the rule that you can expect that permit to have details on such. Okay. Any other specific? Coming back to you thought, Caroline, that there was some hope here to get an additional above and beyond commitment related to sponsorship with outside organizations.
Maybe like some historical context, maybe it's never really been a problem and everyone has cleaned up well and it's not really an issue that needs to be looked at. So I guess maybe asking Ranger Burton what he knows from experience and history.
Sorry, I was going to suggest there are definitely specific language in the permit and the facility use permit that deal with the trash issue.
Yeah, my thought on that, Caroline, I really like the sentiment, but I feel like the department needs to stand on its own two legs with its requirements and enforcement rather than involving third parties here. But I certainly agree with what you're saying.
Yeah, if it's already in the permit, then I'm totally happy with that.
Great. Karen.
This is a question of clarification. I think it's covered in what Dave has already said, but I think it's important enough to clarify. In number 6 that talks about the Colorado Special Event Permit, I'm assuming, Lisa, that you have this as one of the places where we need to distinguish between parks and OSMP not allowing state special use permits, right?
Correct.
Great.
Okay. I remember on item 7, there was look for clarification on whether a minor could apply for an alcohol-related permit, not just be drinking there. Where did we arrive on that? Just that additional clarity could perhaps be there?
Well, again, I think this is pertaining to the Colorado special use permit, and that is sort of beyond our scope.
Yeah,
Or
that got cleared
in
up
our
when
scope.
we were talking.
Yeah, another differentiation here between agencies.
Right.
Okay, passing item 7. Any other items moving down the page?
I think Lisa's got it.
What do you mean, Karen?
I think there's a clear understanding of what we've been talking about, and
Okay,
she can go through and apply it to the specific cases.
Wonderful. So unless anybody else has anything final, I think we're ready to move through those as guidance to staff on City Manager Rule 575A.
Thank you.
Oh, it's up to the board. This is something, again, that the board can just advise staff on. It doesn't require board action on. The motion does, because that goes forward to council. This is, I think, if staff has captured adequately the interest and the intent of the board, we can make those changes and certainly follow back up with the changes that are being recommended. But it doesn't necessarily require, it wasn't called out for public hearing specifically on this one, even though you did get the comment.
Okay. We took specific comment from the public that covered this piece. I feel good about that. So I think we're ready to close that business. Thank you very much, Lisa. Thank you very much, Burton, for being with us for it. And with that, we're going to move on into the matters from the department segment of the evening.
Great.
Thanks, Sam.
Thank you. Thank you, Burton. Thank you, Lisa. I am actually just going to have a short off script. Just wondering, because we have a couple of staff members who are on tonight, just in case there was any questions about one of the written memo pieces regarding the East Boulder subcommunity plan. And I would like them to have the opportunity to decide when they want to head out of this meeting. If there's not going to be, does anybody during matters from the board plan to raise questions about that? Okay.
Aaron, Dave, you both will have questions about that. What I'm hearing from Dan is we can save people time and effort, perhaps by moving questions about those items up in the agenda to now.
Yes, and as long as we're at it, is there any other written information that is going to be called up, if you will, with some questions? Because I think the staff that are maybe on the phone or on the teams wouldn't mind knowing that.
Dave, other than OSO?
Yeah, Sombrero Marsh.
Okay, yeah, that's going to get a presentation.
Yep.
But okay, so nothing else from the written information?
I have nothing. Anyone else with anything?
Okay.
Great.
So if those folks that may be on the phone regarding the East Boulder subcommunity plan, I will add that as before item C. So it will be, well, why don't, because we have, I think we might even have a guest on the line for that. If the board, Hal, if you're okay, maybe we could put that before item B, which might be a little lengthier. I know the presentation for B is, a little bit substantive, and maybe we can address those couple of questions. If we don't feel like it's going to be that big of time, we might be able to put that between A and B.
I predict this taking about 10 minutes on the Open Space Other and East Boulder subcommunity plan. And if you want to do it before or after Sombrero Marsh, I personally am not fixed either way.
Okay, let's go through Sombrero Marsh because I think we have a guest for that too. And so why don't we then address some questions about the East Boulder subcommittee plan after Sombrero Marsh? Is
wonderful.
Okay with that? Okay, great. Well, moving on to our first topic under matters is to provide you with an introduction of a concept that we've been working on at the staff level for some time out at Sombrero Marsh. And to lead OSMP's part of the presentation is Bethany Collins, our real estate supervisor, work group supervisor. And I believe we might even have a representative from Boulder County on who's available as well. So with that, turn it over to Bethany.
Sounds great. Thanks, Dan. Good evening, trustees. Leah, can you pull up my presentation? Great, thank you. With this item under matters and as indicated in the memo tonight, this is an introduction to a proposed phased land acquisition between the City of Boulder's Open Space and Mountain Parks Department and Boulder County's Parks and Open Space Department, involving several small parcels of land adjacent to the city's Sombrero Marsh open space property. We then anticipate returning next month for a public hearing item to request a recommendation to council related to the acquisition. Sandy Duff, Senior Land Officer, and Tina Berghart, Land Officer with Boulder County Parks and Open Space, are also online with us tonight in case there are questions of the county. Next slide, please. Totaling over 20 acres, Sombrero Marsh is the only naturally occurring perennial open water body of its size in the Boulder Valley and is an exceptional ecological resource. The naturally functioning wetland contains soils, hydrology, and vegetation that combine to create important habitat for many birds, mammals, invertebrates, amphibians. In partnership with Thorn Nature Experience, the marsh also provides an educationally rich outdoor setting for teaching about wetland ecology, environmental restoration, and the necessity for exemplary land stewardship. Next slide, please. Sombrero Marsh is also surrounded by urban development, including ownership and management by private parties, HOAs, Boulder Valley School District, Boulder Jewish Commons, ditch companies, and Boulder County, which both accentuates the uniqueness of this wetland complex and it impacts its ecological functions. Next slide, please. The city owns approximately 54 acres in the Sombrero Marsh complex, acquired via multiple transactions from 1995 to 2014 for open space purposes. OSMP staff and partners have put in significant time and effort to restore and manage the ecological health of the city's property. Next slide. Boulder County owns approximately 9.5 acres acquired in 1979 as outlots from the Sombrero Ranch subdivision, which includes some shoreline of the marsh and uplands and neighborhood trail access from Swallow Lane. These are the parcels that are the subject of this proposed transaction. Next slide. Over the years, the agencies, and particularly OSMP, have found that management and stewardship of the marsh and upland complex is complicated under the multi-agency ownership. Currently, Boulder County and the City of Boulder manage their respective parcels at Sombrero Marsh according to their individual land use policies, regulations, and resource management practices, which are sometimes not in alignment. This can lead to ineffective management, confusion for the public, and can be detrimental to the overall ecological health of the marsh. Some examples include trail access, which the county permits trail access over their outlot, which encourages continued access and the creation of undesignated trails onto the adjacent city property. Without consolidated ownership, the resolution here could be fencing bisecting the marsh complex and significant enforcement efforts, which are not ideal. Consolidated ownership allows for thoughtful and comprehensive planning for future access and use. Also, dog management. Dogs are not permitted on city open space land, OSMP land, around Sombrero Marsh, whereas they are allowed on county land. This can be confusing for the public and difficult for rangers to enforce. Water management. The city uses its existing water rights in the East Boulder Ditch to irrigate the land on city property around the marsh. This water also influences the hydrology in the marsh and affects county land in the marsh regardless of their management. Mosquito management, different contractors currently manage mosquitoes on the open space land and county land at the marsh. They must follow different direction from the two different agencies with slightly different goals, which can be inconsistent. Consolidating management under one agency would allow for more effective management and result in better success for OSMP. Coordinating management between the two open space programs that own land at Sombrero has been time consuming and takes away from staff's ability to work on other priority projects. And therefore, recently, OSMP reached out to Boulder County Parks and Open Space to suggest that consolidating ownership under one entity would be of great benefit for consistent and more efficient management. And the agencies have discussed the proposed purchase exchange transaction. Next slide, please. As partners, the city and county are proposing to carry out this phased transaction where phase one, seen in yellow on the slide in front of you, would be acquisition of this by the city of the 4.25 acre western parcel for approximately $34,000, which includes a portion of the marsh and shoreline, and would allow near-term consolidated management of the most significant ecological resources, mosquito control, and proposed boundary fencing projects in the area. Next slide. And this is a general photo of kind of the midsection of this photo is the county land that we're talking about. Next slide, please. As phase 2, the city will then have 5 years to either acquire the remaining parcels for $8,000 per acre or work with the county to identify a mutually beneficial exchange of land of equivalent value. The land exchange would be contingent upon additional OSBT and city council approval if a disposal is foreseen or required, excuse me. If the purchase or exchange does not happen within 5 years, the agreement will include a 2% annual escalation. Next slide. And these are some photos of the parcels, the eastern parcels that we are talking about for a phase 2 transaction. Next slide, please. This proposed transaction would fulfill at least 2 master plan strategies, as well as several charter purposes by having ownership and management control over the entire marsh wetland complex and ecosystem health, and partnering for a land acquisition that preserves water resources and fragile ecosystems. Next slide. We can address additional details at next month's meeting when there will be a public hearing, but do you have any clarifying questions tonight or thoughts on what to address in May?
Thank you very much, Bethany.
Certainly.
That was wonderful. Before before we get too deep into this, I will say on this one, why don't we start out with what are really strictly questions and clarifying questions, and I promise we'll return for more substantive thoughts.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Karen.
The next chunk of land, Bethany, south of Enterprise Ditch, the ownership of that is held by whom?
Boulder Valley School District. They own both of those parcels to the south of Enterprise.
Thanks.
Certainly.
Michelle, did I see you?
Yeah, I have a question about how this will actually work. So I understand there's a phase 1 and there's a phase 2, and then there's a sentence in the memo that says that there are, I'll just read it. The phase 2 parcels are more upland and include several unenforced neighborhood social trails and a permit to Thorn Nature Experience for nature play activities, factors that require more careful analysis and planning by OSMP staff prior to acquisition. Is that prior to acquisition of the second phase? Because I sort of see this as being, as like, once we make the decision to do this, we're doing it. And it's just a matter of timing. But if we don't really talk about sort of how that might impact things like Thorn Nature Experience, like, do we need to have that conversation earlier or like next month?
Right. So this overall transaction. So Boulder County doesn't want to transfer just one parcel. They want kind of an all or nothing. But as part of the negotiation or as part of the conversation, we said we need a bit more time to understand, you know, the neighborhood access, because a lot of times we don't go into a property or we don't acquire a property where it already has certain uses that that come with the property, or we want to understand those uses that come with the property. And so this will give us time to understand that neighborhood access, how it can be either maintained or otherwise changed, along with the planning of the complex as a whole, as well as the permitting to Thorn. As you probably know from the memo, we do have a partnership agreement for other areas of Thorn. So do we continue what's permitted in that area? Is it part of the overall management plan that we have with Thorn, or partnership agreement that we have with Thorn in future years? And so that allows for that a bit more time to understand that planning, to make those plans. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so does that mean you're going to get there by May, by next month, or on those particular issues? You are? Okay.
No, we won't get there. And so, so this gives us, it's almost like an option agreement on a property, in that we have 5 years to do our planning work and to figure out the uses and things like that on the property before we either acquire it for money or acquire it for trade land. So we are guaranteeing that we are going to acquire it within 5 years. We just want to work through more of those potential issues, planning exercises and stuff that we would normally actually do after we acquire a property, right? We do the management planning after we acquire a property very often, but this would be somewhat in advance of that. And of course takes time, as you probably know, with all of our plans.
Thank you.
Sure.
Dave. You're on mute, Dave.
Oh, you're on mute again.
I keep hitting it now. I have two questions. One is, as you referenced, staff has been involved in this locality, open space staff and county staff actually, for a long time. I was somewhat mystified by the memo not including more of the ecological staff's assessment of the contribution of these properties to the overall Sombrero Marsh complex. And so that's my question. Why did they not participate, or why isn't that included in this memo?
You're going to get it in May, I think is my answer. Again, this is, very often we would do a kind of a written memo or to board as kind of a month one introduction to what we're doing, and then follow it with the bigger presentation and public hearings. So this was really kind of an introduction to what we're going to be bringing forward in May, and that will definitely include more of that ecological analysis by John's group for you. Yeah.
Great. I'll look forward to that, as I'm sure the other board members will as well. The other question I had is, as far as a purchase agreement, did you talk with the county about, a joint management where, we've done this before with the county on various properties where one or the other entity under a joint ownership, but has the management responsibility? And first of all, the question is, did you discuss that with them, and kind of how did that end up? And if not, why not?
So we did, we actually went into this talking initially about management. We also talked about how to fence if we go in and do some boundary fencing, because there's considerable encroachments in, in some areas around the marsh. It really became they're small parcels. So very often those joint management is because we have joint ownership, or we have, one agency owns the fee and one holds the conservation easement, and there's an identified managing partner. This is really kind of what we came down to for these parcels, because we own, the majority of the complex, and the county doesn't tend to own a lot of land this close or within the city. And so they just felt like this was land that they'd rather, instead of a management agreement, they'd rather just put under our ownership and management control.
So in evaluating that conversation, are there any other potential properties that you might consider for exchanging?
The reason it's kind of, it's presented as a TBD is we haven't done that analysis. So, as you, is somewhat identified in the management plan is this, the master plan is this idea that we and Boulder County kind of has the intention or will potentially be undergoing the same process in future years, looking at what we own, that even including the assets, the infrastructure we own, but also the land, and saying, are there areas, or does it make sense for a different manager or a different agency to own or manage these properties? And so we haven't done that analysis yet. And so we wanted to leave the door open that if that occurs over the next several years, where we identify a property and Boulder County really has an interest in an exchange situation instead of a straight purchase, that door is open to consider.
Yeah, that was my question as well, Bethany. Just believing in the general concept of de-checkerboarding here, it's natural to wonder if there's a way that we can address another issue where the opposite problem is occurring, and rather than in a cash settled transaction. So you don't have a list of those problems pre-existing in the department's knowledge.
We don't yet, but we and Dan can jump in here. We certainly hope to prioritize those analysis, and again, we've had the discussions where the county really would like to do so as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So getting what we call financial sustainability strategy 8 documented, which was, hey, decision makers do believe that willingness to explore looking at alternative preservation and stewardship options. That was the first sort of door open to look at, where does this checkerboard thing make sense and where it doesn't. In this case, since this will be sort of the first time of opening that up, and the fact that what we didn't want to do is probably go down the road where we identify something and then find out that either the board wasn't and the council wasn't interested in the Sombrero Marsh concept, and we spent all this time. We kind of first thought, well, let's look at the checkerboard at Sombrero Marsh. If it makes sense for us to consolidate that, then we have some time to go to the next step and spend the staff resources and time to first to see if I identify, is there another like parcel, like compensation parcel that makes sense? And then the possibility is the answer may be no. And so then we have that cash option. So that's sort of, Dave, why we sort of went the approval route first for Sombrero Marsh, and then the second step later.
Thanks, Dan. I guess I'll say before we talk about those bigger issues, we have any more clarifying questions? Karen.
I want to thank Bethany and Open Space and Mountain Parks for taking the initiative on this, and I can see how consolidated management by one agency is advantageous. I can also see right off the bat how it's advantageous for Thorne and the county parks and open space system. But I have a lot of questions about what would the cost of taking this on be to Open Space and Mountain Parks. So in addition to Don D'Amico and other ecologists presenting to us next week, I'd really like to see some cost estimates of what it's going to cost Open Space and Mountain Parks to take on what I see as a plethora of issues that then it will be on our plate to resolve, not unlike Hogan Pancoast. And I'm going to need a lot of convincing to understand that.
Can I ask a clarifying question on that? The phase 1 and 2 acquisitions, I mean, we presently are taking on a lot of cost in that area currently, correct?
Right.
We are, and I think John Potter was anticipating a bit of this question, may have some of that prepared if he wants to jump on tonight, but we can also keep it, we can save it for May, but
my question was simple. Isn't the new acquisition somewhat marginal relative to the existing cost there?
Very likely, yes. Yeah, as far as the overlapping costs of invasive management that we've been doing and proposed again, fencing projects that we would potentially be doing anyway, and the mosquito management debacle and things like that. It actually is probably and frankly staff time to kind of deal with the conflicting management. It does come out. There are costs associated with it, which again I will certainly bring forward in the memo, but it's we see it, and that's why we approach the, it's not the county trying to kind of pawn these off as tar babies or anything like that to us. We approach them because these were important to our system and to our staff.
Okay, any more questions? Are people feeling comfortable with this coming back with a more robust memo on those topics for fulsome discussion later? Did we cover what we need to this evening? Dave?
Hal, I'd just like to, I guess, reiterate my request that, the forthcoming memo, Bethany, provide a detailed context of how these properties will fit into the overall, management context at Sombrero, because I think Karen and others' observation is that they come with a number of management issues. And for me, if, our number one goal out there should be to make sure that the land surrounding Sombrero Marsh functions as an ecosystem and not a de facto dog park or social trail, neighborhood social trail access area, and which I think generally those parcels act in that capacity currently. So I'm a little concerned that I want to make sure that we focus our emphasis where it needs to be. So, and anyway, and then I think also the arrangement with the Boulder Valley School District and Thorn on kind of how the whole operation is working, all of that I think is worth trying to get the board to understand how these parcels kind of fit into that overall situation. So thanks.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Oh, and one other thing, so the county got these as outlots as part of the subdivision development. Why aren't they just giving them to us?
For taking problems off their hands.
I mean, it's not unlike, I'll just reference one of our most exciting current prospects. It's not unlike, in my opinion, what we're looking at CU South on the open space other, where CU has done all this stuff that now if we get those properties, we're gonna have to spend a lot of money to actually return them to where we think they should have been because of things that happened previously. And so I'm not particularly eager to spend a lot of money acquiring management issues that we're then going to have to spend a lot of money trying to fix.
Yeah, my response to that, Dave, and I can perhaps provide more detail on the memo, would be, they have a tax base that they've been spending taxpayer dollars to manage it over the years. So they have a fund to basically reimburse or make whole, just like we would say that if we were to do a disposal, that we need to get something. It does have, the properties do have economic value. While they got them, it was like when we would get open space land during an annexation, which does have value to the developer, but it's part of the, like you said, the annexation or the agreement. So there is value there giving up. So there is still value. It is the $8,000 per acre is the value we've come to agree upon is based on outlot and encumbered land values around the area. So we're not paying any kind of, developable lot value that when we get these, but we are again, agreeing to again pay the value. It still is that they would get if they even sold it to the HOA, and or things like that, and also, again making them whole in some of the management they've been doing since the 70s. So. Is that helpful? And I can, again, mention that or try to explain further in the May memo.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful. I think we'll
Certainly.
probably continue to have a conversation, when we get back together.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you for the great presentation, Bethany. We look forward to the memo. Dan, what I'm seeing and what I think I'd like to do is use the next 10 minutes till 8 to call up the OSO and the East Boulder Subcommunity Planning, take a break at 8 and come back for the master plan annual report. Does that seem reasonable?
Sounds good to me, and just want to thank Bethany and thank the Boulder County Park and Open Space staff that hung on with us tonight. So that sounds good, Hal. Let's, I believe that we have a few staff available. Juliet, Casey French might be here. I believe we might have Kathleen King from Planning and Development Services Department. So depending on the question, we'll probably have one or more staff answer or try to respond.
And am I correct that this will also come back in May for board action? Okay.
Yeah, again, we're just trying to set up conversations. This is now the second of 3 touches with the board. There was a March general, now a little bit more of a specific memo, and then we'll follow it up with a full presentation, public hearing, and yet another memo for next month.
I'd just like to make the public aware, we're jumping down to page 52 in our packet, a little out of order on the agenda, so you can follow along. Yeah, I guess there's no presentation, so we'll go straight to questions. Karen, what questions do you have?
It's item B, page 1, under written information, item B, page 1. I went out and looked at these properties, and my biggest concerns are on the property that's on 55th Street at 2323 55th Street, which is a parcel to be updated on the Boulder Valley Comp Plan maps. That is the property where the Humane Society building is located. And the open space other property at the rear of it is, in my observation, occupied by the Humane Society. They have made it into what I would call a human and dog park kind of place with a pond that has an aerator in it. I'm presuming that's because dogs go in it and they need to aerate it to clarify, improve the quality of the water. And there is no fence that I could see between that property and the OSMP property that's adjacent to it. The pharmaceutical company that owns the land just to the south of it has in fact fenced off their property and posted signs saying, this is our property and it's for dogs, welcome dogs. But the adjacent property that's OSMP property neither has a fence nor has any signs indicating who owns the property, nor has any posted signs that I could see saying anything about dogs and what was allowed or not allowed. The open space and mountain parks property, as I observed it, is a wetlands, which to me means it's not compatible with dog use and dog waste. So I have a whole range of questions about the boundary between that property with the yellow highlight around it, the open space and mountain parks property, and in fact, whether it's legal for the Humane Society to be using the OSO land to the extent that they are, and whether it in fact is under the current uses really functionally OSO.
Well, I hear a question that, Juliet, first you can comment. The OSO land is owned privately by presumably whoever owns where the Humane Society is.
Yeah, it's owned by the Humane Society.
Okay.
Regarding the fencing, which I think is out of scope for being addressed in the Boulder Valley or in the sub-community plan, you know, we have a number of, I can see our staff on the phone from John Potter to Jim Reeder. You know, I'm sure they're hearing this and writing down, and I think they'll be willing to go take a look at the priority level of potential fencing there. We obviously spend tens of thousands of dollars every year on fencing.
Right.
Team that's kind of gets together to develop what our priorities are for a given year on fencing. And I'm just looking at Jarrett and Jim and John, and so I think they heard that loud and clear, and I'm sure they'd be willing. I think it's out of the scope of this plan, but Karen, you kind of just raised an outside issue from that. But I don't know, Kathleen, I'd imagine OSO being privately owned, I mean, they would, as any private property, they would have to follow whatever laws govern it. But again, I think that would be out of the scope of what, if they're sort of breaking any laws, that's out of the scope of the subcommittee plan. So my question back to you, Karen, would be is, do you see an issue with shrinking the OSO to just look at that boundary area? Or are you saying like, why is any of this OSO?
I don't understand. I mean, I think historically I have understood what OSO means. And when I saw that property and its current use, I said to myself, is this really OSO? It seems to me it's fully occupied and used by the Humane Society. So I'm not sure that it's really OSO by city definition. So it's a question for the planning department, I think.
I take a somewhat different view personally on that, Karen. I mean, because there is water and it's contiguous to wetland, I do think that it could still benefit from the modicum of additional protection that an OSO designation may provide, you know, as a neighboring property. So I personally like the proposed solution.
So just one thing is, OSO doesn't mean that open space and mountain parks would be under the responsibility at some time to acquire it. Let's just say that property owner, current property owner wants to sell or they want to do some expansive development. Through negotiations of doing something different with that property, being OSO, it could end up being as a direct question to open space. Hey, open space, is this portion of property of interest to you? And then at that time, we could actually formally say, yes, added it into our wetland area, maybe is a good idea. Or we would go back to the planning department and say, you know what, we've looked at it, we went to our board, we're not interested. And at that time, I imagine there would be a formal process to remove that OSO from that property.
And does that request need to come from the property owner?
No, so when we update land uses in that land use map, that's part of our comprehensive plan updates. So you know, we try to always involve property owners when we're making land use changes, but it's only initiated by the property owner, typically if they're looking to do some kind of redevelopment and rezoning.
So Kathleen, I have a larger question, I guess, as far as the planning is concerned, and it addresses some of what Dan was talking about and Karen as well. So the OSO designation, it just strikes me, and this is a good example of there's, you know, a 15-acre OSO designation that is completely developed or is mostly developed. So when was that OSO designation done, and what were the parameters around which it was done? Because from my perspective, when you go from 15 acres to 0.7, because the whole area is developed, it's despite what Hal may think, I think it loses much of its value. And the good example is the ditches, which, you know, are just linear features now, rather than, from my perspective, it should be larger to at least accommodate some kind of riparian value or benefit from those ditches. So can you enlighten us? Am I missing something on the whole planning situation as far as those designations?
So I think right now it's pretty rare that we would apply an OSO designation as part of a planning process. A lot of those designations happened before 1981, and you know, a lot of the discrepancies that we see in some of the mapping is related just to, you know, I think people were being really aspirational and drawing some lines on maps and coloring some things green. And as we digitized a lot of those maps some things don't line up really with a lot of the parcels or ownership structure. And so I think that kind of history plays a role in why we're kind of reevaluating some of these OSO lands, because, you know, as a couple of folks have brought up, the land use designation that is applied to a couple of these areas today doesn't necessarily represent inherent value in the existing conditions for preservation or for acquisition by OSMP. And so that's part of, you know, I think why we're going through this process as part of the sub-community plan, is to take a look at those land uses and really think about what's most appropriate to achieve the goals that we have for some of these features and the different properties.
Kathleen, forgive me,
Hal,
Dave.
let me follow up real quick. So how did that happen, do you think? So from 1981, presumably a lot of the development that we see currently was not there. And so people wouldn't put an OSO designation over an industrial park that, you know, that existed at the time. So what happened in the meantime to change the whole situation with these parcels?
You know, I'd have to kind of dive back into the archives and look at something like the Humane Society and learn more about how it was developed over time to kind of see what the conversation was, if there was any conversation among planning board during development review or something like that. I don't have that information tonight, but would be happy to kind of go back and look into the history if that's helpful to folks.
For me, Kathleen, and Dave, tell me if I've got this wrong, but I'm not interested in the particular history of this parcel, but more in the idea that when someone, a private property owner who owns a piece of land that has OSO designation and is planning to develop it, feeling confident that that is something that comes to this board.
That's correct. That's my concern as well.
That we basically are feeling like this board may never have heard that development in that area occurred and that's happening solely at planning.
That's correct. That's my concern.
And I'd like to see these two examples, Belmont and 47th and 2323 55th, as sort of case studies. So I would appreciate, Kathleen, as you're saying, coming back with some specifics about what happened there. And then, as Hal said, the larger context and discussion of, so what's the process and what are the policies that are amiss or not being followed, or do they not exist?
I would just say, like, I can't comment either what might have happened about 30, 40 years ago, and whether our board maybe did see it and just said, no, we're not interested. I don't know. I could tell you the reason that this is all before you right now is because the planning staff and the open space staff have come together to all look at the OSO. And it's happened, you know, 311 Mapleton was another example. It was OSO set, and I know that our participation on the DRC Development Review Committee is we're there because of these issues. When it's OSO, staff is notified and staff is able to provide input, and then if it rises to the level of action, we bring it to the board. So I think right now we've developed a culture working with departments of where OSO is doing its job. And just because we maybe make a recommendation to either shrink or eliminate an OSO, it doesn't mean it's necessarily a bad thing. It just might be, yeah, that's the most appropriate decision at this time. Yeah, there might have been, and historically, maybe 30 years ago, there was a decision we don't agree with. But right now, I could tell you culturally, we're in a good place, and OSO is serving its role in that way.
Thanks, Dan. I think that's a great synopsis. I personally really appreciate what I feel was nice, sensitive work to reflect the reality on the ground, and also acknowledging if you put your ecosystem goggles on, you can see there is an area of value there that we may want, as Dan said, to talk about at some point in the future. So I thank you for threading the needle sensitively. Caroline.
Yeah, thank you. So Dan, this is kind of for you. And I thought before everyone else spoke that I would be requesting this just because I'm so new to Boulder. I think I understand what you're saying as far as going back 30 or 40 years and how that can be difficult. I also see Karen's point as using it as a case study moving forward for probably the obvious reason to make sure that everyone's in alignment for it happening again. But I was going to request this again just because I am so new to Boulder. Without taking up a ton of time or getting so off track that it doesn't make sense to do it, is there something that you or your staff could provide for us that kind of explains maybe from this point moving forward, if that's the best direction to look at it, how we take it from here? Or like when I look at, and the reason that I was going to ask this question before everyone else did was it says the OSO designation was applied more broadly than necessary to meet the intention of protecting this resource. And when that was written, my thought was, you know, where did that particular sentence, that information come from? Like who looked at that and said, we know that they asked for more land than really was necessary to protect it. And then moving down on that page when it says that it's no longer of interest to open space preservation, only the wetlands on the western portion of the property. I just wonder if it's no longer of interest to open space because, like you said, 30 or 40 years ago, it missed the mark and went under the radar. I just want to make sure that I really understand what's going on, whether it be specific to this or in the big picture. So, you know, moving forward in time, I have a better understanding if this comes up again of what it exactly means. Does that make sense?
Sure, we could, Casey, do you want to say something?
Sure, I was going to say, I think in the memo, I think when we said was applied more broadly, I think the first sentence is like, we believed it was intended to protect the ditches. And therefore the OSO designation we believe was intended to be more broadly. Like we are assuming the intention was the ditches. And so I just wanted to clarify that intention.
Yeah, because when I see that, I think like scientifically, like when they took this amount of land, did they speak with, you know, an expert, a scientist, or someone that said you would need this amount to protect the ditches? And then if that's not the case anymore, did we have another expert come and say that it only required a certain amount? So that's just what I would like to really understand. So moving forward, if something like this comes up again, I have like a better grasp of what we're talking about.
Sure, we can clarify.
The ways we can go about it. We have very specific areas going to be before you next month. And if you think we've missed the mark and leaving some OSO as OSO, shrinking some, you know, that's what we need to hear from you. Then there's the larger opportunity through the more of the full Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan major update, which is in 2025, in which we are anticipating wanting to take a more robust look at OSO. And so there'll be an opportunity to, you know, talk more broadly. If you think you need that context for the two examples of where we're thinking of shrinking for next month, you know, we could work on putting some of that in the memo. Otherwise, what I think I'm hearing from you, Michelle, is, or Caroline, is when we look at the whole Boulder Valley Comprehensive Area and the whole role of OSO and what OSO is doing, that before we start getting into that, maybe we need to do some sessions with our board about some history of OSO, how we think it came into being, some examples. So
yeah, and I'll let the other trustees weigh in too, if after they've heard my question and your response, if they have other ideas as well.
Thanks, Caroline. Michelle, I see your hand there too.
Yeah, so Dan, you must be reading my mind because that's exactly what I was going to ask, is like, how do we get to deep dive learn the history and the meaning of OSO. What comes first? Like, can we, make informed decisions about that in as soon as a month without knowing all of the history and of why it came to be, why we are where we are. I have a feeling about that one way or the other, but I'm curious whether we need some additional information like that you could send to us in advance of next month's meeting that would be helpful for getting to this, so we could have a more productive conversation about it next month. I'm just trying to think of ideas and a process in which we can get to a good point next month. I also just want to do a time check. It's 8:10 and the agenda says we're going to 9. So I know that we could enter into all of these things very deeply, but if there are things that we can compartmentalize, send to us, or follow up on, I would certainly appreciate that. When I read the agenda, and this can be something that we discussed in the future, is when I read an agenda, it ends at 9. I plan another 3 to 4 hours of my day job after this.
Mm-hmm.
So
I
so
appreciate that, Michelle.
We'll
put this right back on track. Karen, do you have something substantive to add, or can I wrap this up, please?
Yes, it's related to all that we've been discussing in a slightly different question. There are mistakes on, for instance, the CU South maps that we've been seeing recently, where the Shanahan Ranch is indicated as a development rights property. That hasn't been true for over a year. So in addition to the questions we've already asked, my question to staff is, how does staff communicate with planning and vice versa to get maps accurate, to reflect open space, real estate departments' actions?
So I think I can answer that one. There's only a couple instances where we update the BVCP land use map, and that's at these major or minor updates, and then after the adoption of a subcommunity plan or an area plan. And those two types of plans are considered an amendment to our comprehensive plan. And so that's why we go through that update process. As lands and properties evolve over time, we don't update them in real time. We do that during these major updates.
But the mini update that was just done was after the acquisition of Shanahan Ranch. So it should be reflected. It should be reflected. And I've been involved in many major and minor updates to BCPs. So I know how all that happens, but it seems to me there's something missing in the process.
Okay. Thank you very much, Karen. In summary, what I heard is that in general, people feel this particular OSO project is looking good for our next meeting. That there is desire to understand how certain parcels did get developed and when and how OSBT was able to check and verify if it was high value, land or not. And certainly I agree with Michelle that some generalized history before we head into the larger update for the plan on OSO would probably be beneficial for everybody. So thank you very much, Juliet and Kathleen, for joining us tonight. It's greatly appreciated.
Nice to see everyone. Thanks.
Thanks.
Great. Okay, I did promise people a brief break, and to try and recover time, I'd like to go to 3 minutes, not 5, if that's okay.
Taskmaster.
Yeah, it's got to come from somewhere.
8:17.
We're back at 8:18. Okay, Leah, I think we can begin. We're going to move into a staff presentation. I'm sure Michelle will be back with us shortly. So Dan, I think the next phase is we're moving on to a staff presentation.
Wonderful. So thank you all. Is the slideshow up? Let me see. I don't think, all right, great, thank you. So this for me is the highlight for tonight. And in fact, this meeting in many ways is an important and exciting milestone for the department is delivering to the board its first annual report of master plan implementation highlights. 2020, for most of you who know this, was the first year the department operated with guidance from the master plan. And as we all know too well, 2020 threw at us all some pretty intense headwinds and unexpected events that challenged the department, challenged the city and our entire community. These circumstances and events indeed tested our resilience and our perseverance, and placed in the spotlight are really our collective abilities to successfully adapt to ever-changing circumstances. Admittedly, it really was a tough year, but one of the reasons that I'm really just so proud of this department and excited to provide the board and the community with the memo that's in your packet highlighting progress is because despite it all, the department can honestly report that there were many examples in 2020, many projects, many actions, many initiatives in which impressive accomplishments were realized. I'm not trying to whitewash, I'm not trying to minimize the effect that COVID, that budget and staffing cuts in the fall wildfire season had on us as a department, because these impacts were real and were certainly felt. And the reality is that we did have to delay, scale back, and sometimes even defer projects. And we did operate with less staff capacity and less monies than we were anticipating when we were planning for the year 2020. Therefore, these unanticipated events and impacts are part of the master plan implementation story from last year. And those events are acknowledged in the memo. But overall, I am confident in conveying that collectively we did persevere, we adjusted, and we made some impressive progress. And the memo in your packet attempts to describe some of these accomplishments. Before we continue with this presentation that we developed to help augment and supplement the packet memo, I would first like to explain that while you will be hearing from only 4 members of the staff during this presentation, the 4 of us are simply representing the work and accomplishments of the entire department. Over the next 20 minutes, you will hear from me and Lauren Kilcoyne, Janelle Freeston, and Jarrett Roberts. But our job as presenters is simply to add a little color and a little flavor to the written memo. And I know I speak for all 4 of us that we are honored to represent the entire staff and all of our colleagues and their work, as well as to our partners and volunteers for their many contributions that they bring to the Open Space and Mountain Parks Department each and every year. Finally, I want to extend a personal thanks to Allison Eklund and Brian Anaker for their contributions in working with staff to develop the memo over the past couple of months to help out with this presentation. So thank you to Allison and Brian. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Great. So the outline for this 15 or 20 minute presentation is this. I'm in the middle of my introduction. I'll introduce say some high level things about the report and just provide you with a quick master plan context. I will then turn things over to my colleagues who will get a little bit more into the meat of the presentation and talk about master plan implementation highlights and themes. And we're going to start off that section in which Lauren Kilcoyne will provide some commentary about the funding situation that we were under in 2020. Janelle Freeston will report back on one of the bigger themes from 2020, and that is the need to be resilient and responsive to change. And Jarrett Roberts will wrap things up and talk about one of the big themes of our master plan and obviously in 2020, and that was how our implementation focused on taking care of what we have. And then I'll come back on and briefly talk about some next step and some other ways that we are communicating out master plan progress as we look at this report and this presentation as just one communication tool, one of many, and I'll kind of touch upon some of the others. At that point, we'll be happy to entertain any questions that you may have from the board, and we have a number of staff would be available to help answer those questions. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Great. So just some high-level summary about what this report is. It's really intended on an annual basis to provide some highlights of master plan implementation actions in the year that was. So in this case, in 2020, and also to provide you with a brief look into the current year. In this case, it would be 2021, as it relates to implementing the master plan. When we were talking about what an annual highlight report may be, one of our goals was simply to help keep the master plan alive and in the public eye. And so one purpose of the report is to remind everybody that the master plan is a living document that we need to go to repeatedly throughout the year. And issuing a report like this is one way to keep it alive in the public eye. The memo is not, however, intended to be an exhaustive, complete list of every action and every project and event that took place in the past year. Instead, it's meant to provide you with some highlights that we think best tell the story. So the memo itself, and then more specifically in attachment A, we describe over 100 accomplishments that, again, I think tries to hit on and tries to provide you a flavor of how implementation went across the board and across all of our focus areas. And then finally, I'll say it again, and I'll say it after before question and answers, is that this report is just one way that we're hoping to tell the master plan implementation, and it's intended to be complemented by other communications and events. So if we can go to the next slide. And I'll just take 1 minute or two to kind of provide some master plan context, because we have a couple of newer trustees that were not actually involved in the development and the recommendation to approve the master plan. So the master plan development process was actually a 2+ year experience. And it began with what we put together before we sort of launched into the engagement part of the process, a system overview report. And you can view that as sort of the baseline documentation report to provide us with where the organization and where the system was at prior to the adoption of the master plan. And that was a pretty big lift, but we thought with this being the first master plan, that overview report would be extremely helpful for future boards and future staff in looking back at where we were at the time our first master plan was adopted. So then we launched into the engagement process and the development process. And I truly think we could call this report a community document. We had a number of open houses. We had thousands of individual comments. We had surveys. We went to board and council multiple times. And so we're really proud of that engagement process that was undertaken. And that was helped develop by what we call the process committee. And a reminder for those who were here and to let those who weren't here, the process committee was made up of 2 council representatives and 2 OSBT representatives who joined staff once a month to help us keep us on time, because we had a timeline that we wanted to accomplish the plan by, and to help us to inform how public engagement ought to happen. And so they were sort of our sounding committee for, hey, are we on time? How do we do this engagement? If there's decisions to be made about the timeline, that process committee helped us in that regards. And it all culminated in September of 19 when the council accepted the master plan. And just a quick reminder, so the 3 main features of the master plan is we have 5 focus areas. They're shown here on the right, and they'll be described a little bit referenced in the presentation, and they're certainly referenced quite robustly in the memo. And underneath the focus areas, we have 28 outcomes. So after a 10-year period of the master plan, what are some outcomes that we hope to see out on our system? And those outcomes are going to help to be realized through strategies. And we have 46 strategies spread throughout our 5 focus areas. And what we did is we prioritized those strategies into 3 different tiers, tier 1, 2, and 3. And there's 10 top tier 1 strategies. And basically the rule of thumb is those are the ones that we ought to pay, that we ought to try to enhance and accelerate and pay most attention to during the initial years of the master plan. So that's the idea with that tiering of those strategies. But there's also an expectation that at the midterm report back in 2025, that we'll take a fresh look at that tiering to see if we got it right. So again, I know that was quick, but we want to get more into the meat of the presentation. So with that, I am going to turn things over to Lauren Kilcoyne, and I believe we can also go to the next slide.
Thanks, Dan. Just a couple quick slides on financial context and information before we hand it off to Janelle and Jarrett. And just a reminder that when we were developing the master plan back in 2019, consistent with what happens across the city, we did develop 3 financial scenarios. One was fiscally constrained, one was restored, and one was full funding. At the time we were going through the 2020 budget process, the master plan had not yet been approved. And so we were doing our best to forecast and predict what was going to be approved in the master plan and make sure what we were doing aligned with the master plan. But those things were developed concurrently. And so we were taking some guesses as we were developing the 2020 budget. So we had been going through a period of changing sales tax increments. At the beginning of 2019, we had a 0.33% sales tax that was reduced to 0.22. Around the same time, the general fund transfer to OSMP that had gone back to the merge of the Open Space and Mountain Parks Department was ending. And we were coming up against a 0.15% increment that was also scheduled to shift to another department at the end of that year. So we were so grateful and so fortunate to have that ballot measure in 2019, November of 2019, pass overwhelmingly in the community to extend that 0.15% increment for 20 years or through 2039. So we were so fortunate that we were able to then look at what does this mean for master plan implementation. The first year 2020 revenues from that increment were dedicated to the purchase of a conservation easement at Long's Gardens. But we knew that going into 2021, we could begin to program that into our budget and think about stabilizing funding and what that meant for our ability to implement the master plan. Next slide. So at this point now, the master plan has been approved. We're entering 2020. And of course, COVID changed life as we know it. We did participate in a citywide requirement to reduce 10% of budget in both 2020 and 2021. And that was meant to respond to and steward funding through some anticipated revenue shortfalls stemming from COVID-19. So our goal as we made those reductions was to remain focused on high priority projects, to make reductions in line with the way we've tiered things and prioritized things in the master plan. And then as we knew that this would also be extended into 2021 and that we were anticipating multi-year impacts from those revenue shortfalls, we wanted to also apply that same fiscally constrained scenario to the 2021 budget. So over on the right, you can see some information on our 2021 CIP in that chart, but our goal was to balance our reductions across our expenditure types, to take a look at things in terms of tiering, and to take a look at things in terms of how we were investing across focus areas. So we reduced 1.8 million from the CIP, 980,000 from our non-personnel operating budget, and 321 from our personnel expenditures. And those were one-time extensions of our vacancy holds from 2020. So I think we all still feel confident and pretty proud of the very cross-functional staff-led work to find the right ways to scale back and responsibly steward the dollars while still accomplishing all of the great work that Dan and the others here tonight will mention. So as all of that was happening, we came to you all for that budget process and through your retreat to talk about ways we want to refine our budget process to better align the budget process with master plan implementation. So as we come back next month and we're talking about 2022 CIP, we've continued to think about how to tell the story better, how to integrate better, et cetera. So overall for current year, we feel really excited that over 76% of our projects aligned with tier 1, and we would want to continue that trend into next year. Next slide. So now as we shift into our future look and start thinking beyond COVID and getting back to normal, We anticipate as we go through the 2022 process, you'll continue to see a big emphasis on tier 1 strategies. As we talked about in the retreat last fall, one of our big lessons learned as we brought forward the 2020 and 2021 budgets was the interconnectedness of projects. So we had this idea where each CIP project would be tied to its primary strategy, and we learned very quickly that most projects hit on multiple strategies, that our work isn't done in silos, and that we need to find a better way to represent the total investment from a capital project. So we anticipate as we come forward in 2022, we'll continue to prioritize projects that advance multiple focus areas and strategies to try to maximize the benefit on the system from the investments that we're making. So as always, we'll be continuing to improve our alignment, our storytelling. We'll look for feedback from you all to make sure that we hit the mark for all the feedback that you gave us last year. And overall, we want to make sure that the financial sustainability work is really the underpinning of our master plan implementation, and that we're here to support the ability of our colleagues to get work done on the ground in all of the other focus areas as demonstrated in that graph. So with that, I will turn things over to Janelle.
Thank you, Lauren.
Great. Thank you, Lauren. So I would imagine that resilience became a very real concept for all of us in 2020. And as defined, resilience is the ability to recover or adjust easily to misfortune or change. And one way to build up personal resilience is through support and gratitude. And in that spirit, I want to echo what Dan said at the beginning, that OSMP staff really went above and beyond, staff, volunteers, the community, to take care of each other, take care of the land, and help to create the safest working conditions possible, while also being responsive during the global pandemic, economic downturn, and then the historic wildfires that we experienced in 2020. It was a lot, and we're still in it, right? We're not out of this yet. An example of this, in the early months of the pandemic, some of our staff were able to go home, right? And we were working from home. Whereas others, like our trailhead staff or our signs team, pictured in this photo, they weren't able to work from home. They had to very quickly adapt and be able to continue those services to support our community. And an example of that is if you think about cleaning the outhouses, our trailhead staff, this is when we didn't know in COVID how it was spreading. And so they put their well-being on the line to very quickly create safe guidelines and SOPs so that they could keep our community healthy and to be able to continue to use the trails and our services at the trailheads. Other field staff had to really quickly figure out how to access buildings. How many people can we have in a building at a time? What will our protocols be if there were to ever be an outbreak? How are we going to access equipment? How do we safely interact with visitors with our face coverings on? We're so used to being able to be expressive. The rangers, and the outreach staff and the education staff, that was our bread and butter. And now we had our faces covered. And how do we do that? There was a lot of adapting. Other adjustments I'll mention here, all of you at home, OSBT, the community, we moved to online platforms like this. That was an adjustment. And for some of us, we traded possibly a serene, wonderful morning commute, and instead we traded it, instead of going to the office, we were dodging piles of laundry to try to log in online for our first morning meeting. So it's a lot. Other highlights, OSMP Rangers right at the get-go, field staff, the safety committee, they really pulled together to create some initial SOPs. And then the OSMP stabilization and recovery team, known as START, was then able to help take over, put in hours and hours of adjusting guidelines based on public health orders and responding to the many changes of the COVID dial. I will say I'm sad we will never get to see green, protect our neighbors. I think it's changing, but stay tuned, more to that. Also, again, our OSMP volunteers remained very resilient. They were on hold for months. Some of them weren't able to volunteer at all due to personal choice and preference to stay safe. Others were able to volunteer with us. And so you can read more about that in your memo about our volunteer services annual report. And finally, right before, well, you can go to the next slide. The final thing is that our high visitation COVID compliance team, also known as HVAC or HVNCC, they were created, which I'll talk about more here, to be able to recommend and implement actions for dealing with the ever-changing visitor patterns that we experienced, while also managing public safety and resource protection. And if you can all remember, you can see this graph here. This shows, the very early days of stay-at-home orders. Very soon after, we saw visitation changing. And that was based, this here is based on aggregate counts from 11 trail counters. And if anyone here or at home wants to learn more about visitation during 2020 on OSMP lands, you can go to our Visitation Data Explorer on our website. Now, I can say my numbers, like my family, we were probably represented in these numbers here. I can't even tell you the amazing, how many times we thought about how lucky we were to have the open space trails after long days online, long days with doing online schooling for my 2 boys. It was just truly kept our sanity. And I can turn this on right now, sorry. In response to that change, OSMP was able to enact 50 actions, really responding to that increased visitation on our lands. And one of the reasons we could do that, wrapping this back to the master plan, is that the master plan was in place. The actions that we enacted, and I'll highlight a few of them, were aligned with the master plan, and the master plan really set us up for success. Some of those which were highlighted in the memo, the Flagstaff area, we saw lots of visitation there. So we installed variable messaging signs. We opened up the Flagstaff Summit earlier in the season to be able to manage parking congestion and some of the illegal parking that was happening along Flagstaff Road. We closed picnic shelters in the early days and the Boulder Star to try to limit large group gatherings. And then system-wide, we increased trash service, dog waste compost service, and then that outhouse service that I mentioned to 7 days a week. So, here we are operating under all of these conditions while also there was a hiring freeze. We had some furloughs. So it was a huge scramble on staff to be able to do this. And staff responded with the most integrity and commitment and perseverance. Couple other things, staff were also out on the trails conducting rapid assessments and inspections to help inform what kind of decisions we were going to make, because trail conditions in some areas were changing, and we were trying to map those patterns. And then finally, in some certain areas, we installed one-way directional signs, which you remember, and then we were monitoring for social distancing, face cover compliance. And we had a COVID outreach team that mobilized who made over 92,000 contacts and handed out over 1,700 free face coverings. And we organized some of that with other city departments. So I will say partnerships was a huge part of all of this as well. If that's resilience, you can't do this without a partner. Next slide. And finally, it's easy to remember that feeling of fear and anticipation after we've had a year of roller coaster, right, of emotion. And then we had the fires. And on October 17th, those fires got really quickly out of control and very close to our open space properties. At times, the fire was spreading at 1,000 acres per hour, which was unprecedented. And as stated here, you can see OSMP stepped up and we responded and we supported other agencies. And that, again, is what resiliency is about. It's supporting others in times of need. And someday, hopefully not, we're prepared, and I'll talk about that in a second. If that happens on OSMP lands, if and when, other agencies will come to our call and help us as well. You probably read in the packet that the forestry team has been working on this for years through their FEMP, the Forest Ecosystem Management Plan, and they've completed over 75% of the projects outlined in that plan. So that's incredible. And still, the Cowwood fire did put some fire to all of this work, right? And so we are going to further accelerate some of that fuel mitigation efforts next year by adding more temporary staff and completing some additional fuel reduction treatments. And we've joined up with Boulder County Parks and Open Space and Jefferson County to work on a research study on the impact of carbon stocks on fire severity. So a lot of really good hard work. And again, it couldn't have happened if we didn't have that master plan in place to really help guide us and help us to make those quick decisions in response to this rapid change that we were seeing on our lands and in our community. And with that, I'll pass it over to Jarrett Roberts, who's the Visitor Infrastructure Supervisor, and he'll talk more about taking care of what we have. Thank you.
Thanks, Janelle. And Michelle, welcome. It's nice to see you and meet you. So I'm going to talk for a minute or two about taking care of what we have. And I want to start by just reminding, Dan talked a little bit about all the public input and all the process that went into the master plan. And one of the big pieces of that was the master plan survey that went out. And if we remember, some of the data that was taken from that shows that the community is really centering around taking care of what we have across our system. And that really confirms the direction of the previous 2005 visitor master plan, which again was approved in 2005. And so with this direction, a lot of work has been done to take care of what we have across the system, to encourage visitors to use visitor use where appropriate and protect our native ecosystems while balancing appropriate expansion. I'm going to spend a couple minutes highlighting just some of the great work. I think Dan mentioned this is a highlight reel of a highlight reel, so I feel like I'm an ESPN sportscaster getting to just talk about the highlights, but there was an entire game that was played. So if you want to look at all those details, go back to the memo for sure. And just a reminder that I'm going to look at these for each focus area. And I really wish I could show all the work that we've done, but you know, I think we would be here at least till tomorrow, if not a couple days later. So realize that there's just a lot of amazing work that's been done out there. And then I just feel very fortunate, as I'm sure Janelle, Dan, and Lauren and Steve do, that we get to be here and we get to represent this work. But this work, all that we're showing you really represents all the work that was done by hundreds of dedicated staff. It shows their passion and hard work. And so I just want to acknowledge that there were a lot of people that made all of this happen. So thank you to everyone. So within the focus area of ecosystem health and resilience, we're really taking care of our existing ecosystems. So staff have restored habitat on a number of projects, doing things like removing large native trees and shrubs, planting native plants. And we've done this at locations such as Boulder Creek, South Boulder Creek, Skunk Canyon, and Bluebell Canyon. Karen may have noticed there were a couple new neighbors in the Shanahan area as we moved some cattle in this past year for the first time to begin, or on a larger scale, to begin more grazing in the fenced areas. And we put some additional foot cleaning stations, and all this was part of a project to help control an emerging invasive tall oak grass. So you may see the signs out there saying, "Don't tote the oat." We did over 1,700 feet of undesignated trail restoration, which is pretty impressive. And then all of this was to help make sure that our native ecosystems are more resilient and better adapted to future climate change. On the grassland soil health front, we did some grassland soil health data or set up some studies and took data which were adjacent to the long-term vegetation monitoring sites. And the really amazing thing about this is it'll allow some above and below ground findings to be compared, which is pretty cool. And then we had over 20 monitoring projects ranging from raptors to forest understory. And this is great because this is going to help to continue to provide data, which as we analyze it will inform future management decisions. Within the area of agriculture today and tomorrow, we had a lot of help in this area, I guess. And so we'd like to say a huge thanks to our 38 tenants that helped manage over 1,500 acres. These partnerships are critical to maintaining productive agriculture that balances soil health and high value habitat. Agriculture also represents one critical opportunity for carbon sequestration, as you all probably know. Our tenants didn't get to have all the fun though. As you can see from these numbers, we did an impressive 25,000 linear feet of irrigation ditch maintenance. And just to get a sense of that, that's roughly as if there was a ditch going from Encar to Wonderland Lake and we maintained the whole thing, just for a size comparison. Compost was applied at a number of properties, including Packlamar, Awida, Dawson, and Williamson, with our staff noting that Packlamar had the best yielding results. Then as we move into the responsible recreation and stewardship and enjoyment area, we had some major repair in place, reroutes, and maintenance projects across our trail system, all within the existing trail system. And it's important to note that a delayed start, the crews really didn't hit the ground until mid-July. And so this represented about a half of our normal capacity of on-the-ground work. And yet the crews and the trail program were able to accomplish many of the goals that they'd set out to accomplish in 2020, which included over 100 stone steps being added to the system, 8,700 feet of trail was constructed or had major maintenance. And then going back to that collecting data, we were able to do a fifth of the system. We monitored our designated and undesignated trails, which will help us inform future management decisions again. Within community connections, education, and inclusion, we created a COVID outreach staff who, as Janelle mentioned, reached over 90,000 visitors and handed out over 1,700 free face coverings. We also shifted some of our programming to online and created new partnerships such as those with Jeff and Paige, which have reached an international audience from what we've heard. We provided 26 bilingual hikes and programs. And we also provided over 124 youth or COVID safe youth and family programs to connect our next generations to public lands. And then one that I'm very proud of, we work with a program called Ready to Work. I'm not sure if many people are familiar with that, but they directly assist people experiencing homelessness. And they named us as their partner or employer of the year, which we were very proud of. They work with many people and thought that we had done a really good job engaging their group. And so again, those are just a very few highlights, and thanks for the opportunity to do that. And with that, I'll pass it back to Dan. Up and Dan, you might be muted.
Thanks, Jared.
All right. I was just thanking you, Jarrett, and thanking Janelle and thanking Lauren. As Jarrett so I think perfectly said, a highlight reel of a highlight. So the memo was meant to be a highlight, and this presentation obviously is just to sort of provide some color to that memo. So we did not feel we either had the capacity or that it was the best thing to put all of our bandwidth into one memo, realizing that the OSBT is our primary audience with the memo. But there's other ways that we wanted to sort of tell the master plan implementation story and keep that master plan alive, like I was saying earlier. So in the coming month, we are going to, in the coming year, we're going to be doing a number of different things, highlighted perhaps with a community virtual open house that will begin later in April and run through May. That's going to be highlighting a number of program areas, including our restoration, some of our restoration projects that are upcoming, trail projects, and other things. So we're super excited about that. And if there's questions about that, Allison would be able to answer anything about this upcoming virtual open house that we're putting together in conjunction with the new web page that's going to sort of be hosting the open house and as a way for us to highlight master plan implementation. We're also going to be having several pages in a community-wide publication that goes out to residents throughout Boulder. And I think we're going to have 4 pages dedicated to open space and mountain parks, in which we're going to be highlighting master plan implementation. And it'll be a chance for us to dive a little bit deeper into some feature stories that we want to highlight in regards to some of the work that we did in the past year with regards to implementing the master plan. You're going to notice already in your memo today, and then through future presentations, and Lauren hit on this, that through the budget conversations that we're going to be linking directly to master plan through upcoming budget discussions. And then of course, through open space and mountain OSBT meetings, retreats that hopefully we can start to resume out in the field, and field trips. That we make it a point to always try to link toward how this relates to the master plan. And so in our presentations and our memos, we're really trying to be really concerted effort to make that linkage back to the master plan to help keep it alive and to keep you informed of that. And finally, attachment A, I think, is the is kind of an important piece in this memo, in which we've highlighted nearly 80 accomplishments and 50 projects that we hopefully are going to come to fruition this year, and that are arranged by focus area. So again, I think there's a number of ways throughout the year that will touch upon the master plan, and this report is sort of just one, but a big culmination, but yet just one tool. So with that, that is the presentation, and that's supporting the memo, and we will be happy to entertain any questions. And again, we have staff representing all the areas of the department that can help in responding. So Hal, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Dan. And thanks everybody for this wonderful presentation. There are a lot of accomplishments here. I think for the sake of our current time this evening, the thing I would like to do is accept generalized questions on the report. This is the first status report out on the master plan. So I think perhaps what the best use of our time is for any board members to offer brief feedback on the format and sort of organization of this report. I think we're going to have a lot of time to dig into individual items, but just to go very macro on how we feel about the structuring for the first master plan annual report. I am going back to the individual view. I see Caroline.
Hey, super quick. I just wanted to say that the Science at OMP website is wonderful, and I loved seeing that. And thank you to everyone that I'm sure spent a lot of time putting that together. Super, super fun. I loved it a lot.
Great, thank you. We have a whole science team that will take the credit for that one.
Dave. You're on mute, Dave.
Thank you. Dan, I just wanted to say I found the memo and the presentation very helpful. I think it reflects a lot of thought and organizational focus, and I think certainly in the coming year it will provide a good background and foundation for what we're anticipating going forward. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Dave.
Karen, I saw your hand too.
Yeah, I want to agree with my colleagues. It's really been an incredible year. And just when I think about the number of times the signs had to be changed because of mandates being changed, I get exhausted thinking about creating new signs and replacing them all again and going around that barn one more time. There's something that you mentioned, Dan, that I totally agree with, and that is using multiple formats to get this report out. And I think there are lessons to be learned from a lot of our regional partners that you worked more closely with this year than in 2020 than previously. And I look at this in terms of getting back to the entire community that helped frame the master plan. And I would like to see us do a better job of reaching back out and getting this information out to the entire community that helped create the plan. A couple of things that came to my mind as you all were giving your report includes using the email addresses of all the people who have been participating to send things out to them. And perhaps instead of using a fire hose approach, to tell them everything at the same time, to 4 to 6 times a year, sending out smaller bits of information so that people had a better chance to consume smaller chunks at a time. But I really am looking forward to the return of field trips and in-person meetings and all those kinds of things that can engage people better. And one last suggestion, there's been a lot of emphasis both in the master plan and in your report on reducing backlogs of trail maintenance, of agricultural infrastructures and so forth. And it would really help communicate to the public, I think, if those were framed in terms of how much of the backlog we have reduced. This year, we were able to do so many million miles of fencing or trails or whatever it is, which represents a reduction of 10% of the backlog or whatever it is. So that people know where we are in a status kind of basis.
Thank you, Karen.
Thank you, Karen.
Michelle, I saw you had your hand up as well.
Oh, I also wanted to reiterate what my colleague said. And one thing that I appreciated with this report is how each action connected back to the master plan by code. So as somebody who's recently read the master plan, I was like, okay, I'm going to go to this section and be able to cross-reference how this connected to the master plan. And so that was just very helpful for me and wanted to convey that.
Great, thank you. I'll just jump in here. I note that it is 9 o'clock. It has not been our recent form to do anything formal to extend a meeting. I do think that we can get the remainder of what we want done in the next half hour or so. So barring any ferocious opposition, I just wanted to note that for us. I have one comment on this myself. First off, I thought it was excellent. And like you said, Dan, attachment A really was a very concise, condensed, beautiful way for me, even as a board member, to really get fully and granularly up to speed. The only small piece of constructive commentary I might add is that I think going forward in terms of, whether an individual or organization and self-growth, taking an opportunity just to discuss a couple goals that might have been missed and explaining a little about why and how that dovetailed into the plan for next year, I think would just make it a little bit more alive. But I really felt that Schedule A was just very well done.
Great, thank you, Hal.
It was 2020. Anything that wasn't done, just COVID.
COVID.
Does anybody else have more on that? This strikes me as the type of thing where emails from board members to staff, as they really spend more time digesting it, could be useful. Obviously to Dan directly, whether those are in specifics or format and macro. So I think there's a lot of opportunity over the coming year to keep the conversation up about this document and where it might head for us and staff and the community.
Right.
Excellent. Well, I'll personally say thank you to all the staff who stayed on the call for the presentation and all the work that did go into this. We know this isn't an easy report to build. With that, I guess, Dan, you have verbal updates for the board as well.
Rapid fire time here. Just wanted to note that we didn't put out as of a robust monthly email update. I ended up putting a few in last week for you. So I got a few more to provide you tonight. First of all, I'll start off with a little bit of sad and happy news. We have a pretty significant retirement looming at the end of the week. After 20 years with the department, our Trails and Facilities Service Area Manager, Jim Reeder, is going to be retiring. This is, as he calls it, his third career within his career and his best one yet. And I just personally, I had the opportunity to go out and walk Homestead Trail and at South Mesa this morning. Jim and I, boy, that fog was beautiful against the Flatirons early this morning, and had an opportunity to kind of give my farewells to Jim. And but I just want to use this opportunity to just let the group know of Jim's retirement and an opportunity for me to just to thank you for building such a strong, robust Trails and Facilities work group. It's a work group with tremendous bench strength, and I told him today, I go, you're really leaving at a perfect time, because you're leaving me with really nothing to deal with, no residual damage, if you will, and so I think he's very proud of that. But I just wonder if there's anything, Jim, feel free if you want to get on and say anything. We'll provide that opportunity. If I don't see your screen up, I'll assume you're okay with where you're at. This will also be an opportunity for me just to let you know that over the next coming months that Steve Armstead is going to be sort of shifting over, if you will, and filling that backlog with Jim's absence as we sort of prepare and strategize of how best to fill Jim's position. So Steve's going to provide some coverage for the Trails and Facilities group in the meantime. So you may hear and get responses from subject matters you're not used to hearing Steve on. and that's why. So I just wanted to kind of call that. But I do see Jim here, so thank you, Jim.
Yeah, I just like to say I consider it a very big honor and privilege to have spent the last 20 years working for the Open Space Department. I really think that the work that we do and the people that I got to work with are just a highlight of my life, and I really appreciate it. I am leaving not because of any problems, other than it's just the right time for me to move on to another chapter in my life. And so I'm leaving with happy thoughts, and I'll be thinking of the people I've been working with a lot. I will miss a lot of the people, really all the people that I get to have gotten to work with. So.
Well, Jim, I want to say personally, I remember at my first meeting when I first met you, being really pleased to know who, in my personal opinion, was really at the center of what we do on this system, and keeping it beautiful for this community, keeping it functional. And the work that you've done for us cannot be understated in any regard. Certainly, we spend a lot of time in this board talking about words on the page, but what you've actually done for the people of Boulder out there is true yeoman's work, and my respect is huge for that. Thank you so much for all of it.
Well, thank you for those kind words. And I will say that I get a lot of help. I've had a lot of help. I've got a great team in all of my work groups.
Dave or Karen? Yeah.
I want to add my thanks too. And you know, Jim, when board members leave, somebody on staff puts together how many properties and miles of trail and stuff. I want to hear how many miles of trail there were when you started, because I know we have a ton more miles of trail now than we did. And
I'll have to look that up.
as well as additional staff.
Yes, I'll have to look that up, because I would like to know that too, actually. There are quite a few more miles.
Been huge.
Yep.
Thank you.
Dave.
Yeah, Jim, I want to say my thanks as well. It's been a long time, and we've worked together in various capacities that I've thoroughly enjoyed. You know, I'm remembering when Jim was first hired, I remember this distinctly. We were sitting around the conference room table in the Ricky Weiser conference room, and talking with Jim, and I looked over at him at that time and said, I hope you know what you're getting into. And he kind of looked at me like, huh? But I will say one of the most impressive things from my perspective was Jim's leadership after post 2013 flood, when there was so much trail damage, so much damage to the open space system, which took years to fix, that we're still working on. But Jim jumped in, and it was very impressive. And we're going to miss you, and I'm especially going to miss you. But good luck and have fun. Thanks again.
Thank you. I will say I did not know what I was getting into. It's been a lot more fun than I thought it might be. The highlight of my life. It really has been.
It's been great.
Thank you, Jim.
All right. Thank you, Jim. And we'll see you tomorrow for another send-off with all staff.
Yep. Sounds good.
Okay, just a couple more quick updates. Some of you, Hal, Dave, Karen, sat in on last week's tribal consultation. The city representatives, myself included, had the honor of meeting with 11 tribes, had representatives at the meeting. We met for a full day. We had a lot of robust conversations. We made a lot of progress on subjects ranging from Settlers Park renaming to developing a land acknowledgement and to going through a new iteration of the memorandum of understanding that we have with the tribes, which still needs some more work, but progress was made. And we'll put together a written report that summarizes it. It just wasn't time in the last week to do that for you tonight, but just want to acknowledge that it took place, and I thought it went really, really well. And compared to 2019, I thought a lot more progress was made in this one-day meeting than was made in 2019. So I walked away super enthused and super excited. So just want to.
And I just have to repeat something that I've already told Dan to the whole board. And I am sure that that increased progress was due to the kind of trust that Dan and staff have built over the last year in all the interim conversations and communications they've had with each other, because the whole tenor of the meeting, as well as the progress, was remarkably different than 2019. So thank you, Dan.
Thanks, Karen. Again, big team behind me. Christian Driver, Phil Yates from our department deserves a big credit. Just want to let you know that after a couple of months of anticipation and delays, council, we finally were able to provide that update on the Rocky Mountain Greenway to council last night. We had about an hour conversation with them. Some of the council members weren't around in 2016 and 2017, so some was context setting, and we walked away with basic thumbs up to continue to proceed with moving forward with the next phase of design and construction of the underpass. So a good meeting, a lot of great conversation. And again, Mark Gershman did a great job of pulling the information together and putting a concise presentation together for the council. I provided you with an email update that Long's Garden officially closed. So we are now the overseers of a conservation easement out there. So multiple years of work led by Bethany Collins. So kudos to Bethany and the real estate team. And finally, Steve wants to provide you with a very brief update on some of the next touches that you'll be seeing with regards to dog management. So Steve, if you want to just provide that outline.
Okay, sorry about that. We had to quickly get myself unmuted. Just to give you an update, since it wouldn't show up on the rolling calendar that you have in your packet, we are going to be following up on the next item we wanted to get in front of the board regarding a follow-up for the Voice and Sight, which was to share out the various Voice and Sight trail and area changes that are included in various plans, such as the North Trail Study Area Plan or some of the site plans we've completed that haven't actually been implemented. And we're planning on sharing that out as a written item in July. And so we've, from I think what we last communicated, we've slipped back a few months only because the last couple of meetings have been robust enough that we didn't want to try to manage the content level. But you will have that item coming forward. Currently as the plan time is July.
Great, thank you very much, Steve.
All right, so I think that covers my verbal updates for tonight. And so I think we're ready to move into matters from the board. Al.
Great. Before we move to the specific slated topic, I just wanted to ask if there's any final questions related to the written information in the packet. We tried to get some staff members earlier involved on the Open Space Other and East Boulder Subcommunity Plan, but just thought it'd be a decent moment. Is anybody had anything there in their notes that they were itching to discuss? Great. Wonderful. Well, the matter from the board is a declaration to honor open space and mountain parks volunteers during National Volunteer Week, April 18th through 24th. There's a full memo in the packet, and I believe, Dan, tell me if I'm wrong, the tradition has always been for this declaration to be read simultaneously by all board members, showing our great enthusiasm for this volunteerism. I originally said, maybe that won't work so well on Zoom, but then during the course of the meeting, I thought maybe we could break the internet and try to do this how we've always done it and traditionally done it. What do you think?
Well, hell, I actually, traditionally, I think it was sung.
Oh, sung.
No, no.
I think it was sung.
You're not gonna want to hear that.
We will break the internet.
That'll be our last Zoom meeting if that happens.
I just want to see if Dave is indeed a baritone.
Yeah.
You're not old enough to make that kind of claim, Dan.
Well, I do think it's a deeply important topic. Volunteerism is really a lot of the lifeblood of what goes on in this system. So maybe I'll ask instead for a volunteer who might like to jump down to the declaration and read it for the board.
I'll be happy to do that, Hal.
Wow, Dave, thank you so much. Do you have it there? You know what page you're on?
I do.
Great.
Open Space and Mountain Park staff ask the Open Space Board of Trustees to join them in honoring those dedicated people during National Volunteer Week with this declaration. The Open Space Board of Trustees joins the staff of the City of Boulder Open Space and Mountain Parks Department in recognizing all our volunteers during National Volunteer Week 2021. We salute the hundreds of Open Space and Mountain Parks volunteers who contributed their talents and efforts in helping the department carry out its city charter purposes for open space. This community of volunteers is an inspiration as their contributions help to protect the resources and provide for enjoyable experiences, making Boulder's open space and mountain parks a special place. And my compliments and appreciation as well.
Yes. Thanks, Dave. I'll say for myself, each experience I've had going out, all of these forms of volunteerism are wonderful, and the department does a great job of showing people a good time. So for the public, I really encourage you, get on the website, check out what's happening. It's a fun thing to be involved with. I guess that is the last official meeting on our agenda tonight. I'm looking towards closing, but before we do that, I would like to go back to the second page of the packet and look at the out agendas briefly with the board. We have quite a bit of business in front of us, and I just thought 2 minutes to talk about all that might be helpful and useful. We will be marking our calendar for May 12th for our next meeting. The action items being looked at are the recommendation to council of the OSMP acquisition of Boulder County Parks and Open Space parcels at Sombrero Marsh, which we discussed this evening, and which will be coming back with a more robust memo. There will be the East Boulder Sub-Community Plan action, which we also delved into preliminarily this evening. Also, discussion of a trail easement acquisition. Very important matters. I do encourage people to really get into the written information in this week's packet, because we're going to be looking at the draft 2022 CIP, which is very important spending related things. And we'll have Lauren there to give us some great detail on that. And we're also looking forward to some verbal updates related to all the activity that's going on with the CU South annexation. And so I imagine there's some discussion there. So encourage everybody to get prepared for a robust meeting. Karen, I see a question.
Yes, under matters from the board for May 12th, I'd like to suggest that we also have CU South there, because as the motion from the March 10th meeting indicates, where is it? It says that we're going to be coming back with more information to council soon. And so I think we ought to initiate that at the May 12th meeting.
That sounds like a good idea. Dan, we can take up sort of where that update in CU South lives on the agenda there a little bit.
Yeah, and Karen, were you referring to annexation or more flood mitigation?
More flood mitigation, because when we
Oh.
did the March 10th motion, we said this is just about the annexation term sheet, and we'll be coming back to you soon to provide updates about construction mitigation and operations of the variant 1 flood mitigation. So we need to address that under matters from the board, in my opinion.
Okay, so Hal, one thing that you as chair, you might want to do is just get a feel for the scope of that, that issue and time allotment. With three public hearings already on the agenda, we need to get a good feel for that. And then looking ahead into the summer, we've got some pretty robust CU South discussions on the platter as well.
Yeah, we'll talk about that. It could be possible that just written material would be included, something to that effect. It is a packed day. So Karen, we'll go there. Caroline?
Hey, I just wanted to bring something up, just to be respectful for everyone. And since I guess this would kind of be a new year with Michelle being new on the board, I know if you look at the minutes from our last meeting, it showed that we adjourned at like 1 a.m. And knowing that we have a bunch of items moving forward each month, I think that all of us on the board and staff kind of know how our time frame works, even though the schedule says 9 o'clock. So just out of respect for Michelle, I don't know if we should change the time on our packets first, because we know, just wanted to put that out there.
Yes, we'll take a realistic look at the time frame on this upcoming meeting. Great. Well, thank you again to all the staff members joining us. Thanks to all the community members. And with that, I believe we can adjourn this meeting. Karen?
Job, 21 minutes. Good job, Hal.
Question, Dan. Last time we asked, you said that staff had no further information on the El Dorado Springs planning timeline. And I'm wondering if staff can get a sense of whether the state park staff is going to be moving forward with a plan, or whether they've actually dropped that work, or.
Sure, we'll be happy to.
Because I don't see it anywhere on the forthcoming agendas. And to me, that means the state staff has decided to drop their planning effort.
Dan, I can cover that. Karen, we're still waiting for an answer at this point. We're in a holding pattern and we are in contact with them. But once we get something, we'll let you know straight away, we promise you.
But could you verify that they're really going to be doing a plan, or whether because of COVID, they've decided not to, or?
All we know at the moment is it's delayed and we're still waiting to hear.
I understand that.
Yeah,
We've heard that several times. It seems to me it takes some initiating a conversation with them.
Yeah, when we have been in touch, we're still waiting for that response. Is it delayed or is it postponed? Exactly.
Okay.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful evening.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.